Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Joan Esposito Show. My name is William Muck, and I'm back filling in for Joan today. I was guest hosting on Friday, and I'm so excited to be back with you to continue that conversation. As many of you know, I'm a political science professor at North Central College out in Naperville. I hope Joan is enjoying her time in California. The good news for us here in Chicagoland is the weather is also pretty darn good. Maybe not California good, but for March, we can't complain. The other bit of good news, at least for me, is that we're back on daylight saving time. I'm one of those people that as we get through winter and those short nights and the sun going down early is pretty tough. So I love the fact that the sun's out. So maybe there's some good news out there. All right, let's talk a little bit about what we got for the show today. I'm really excited. It's a good one. So I'm going to open the show with a few thoughts on how we respond to this dangerous moment we find ourselves in. I'm going to also talk a little bit about the Trump position on Ukraine and what more broadly I believe has developed into what we can call a Trump doctrine. So we'll open the phone lines up around 2:15 and keep them open until 3:30. At 3:30, we're going to be joined by Robert Rowland, who is a communications professor at the University of Kansas. Now, he specializes in presidential rhetoric, and he's going to talk with us about the unique way that Trump uses language to mobilize his supporters and divide the country. He's written a book about this. It's really, really sort of fascinating to dive into that language and rhetoric and understand the tactics that are at play there. Then at 4 o'clock, we're going to be joined by Dr. Suzanne Chad, who many of you already know. She's also a professor at North Central College. She specializes in American politics, and she's going to come in to help us make sense of this dumpster fire that is the American political system right now. But specifically, I want to talk with her about Democratic strategies. What does the Democratic Party need to do? Where is it at? How does it move forward toward the midterm, next presidential election? So I'm having her on so we can think through some of those questions as well. Then to close the show, we're going to talk with Lauren Chu, who is the communications director for the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, or the DLCC. This is the arm of the Democratic Party with the mission of building democratic power in the states and then setting the national agenda at the state level. Now, if you're feeling a little unsure about what to do and how to fight for your democracy, you will not want to miss that conversation. Lauren's going to bring some serious optimism about ways that individuals can make an immediate impact on their democracy, specifically at the state level. It's a very, very empowering message, and she's just got wonderful, wonderful energy there. So all in all, it's going to be a fun show, and as always, I'm really looking forward to hearing from you as well. So, all right, let's dive in. On Friday, when I was here, much of the show was focused on diagnosing the problem, trying to figure out just how dangerous of a moment this is. How big of a threat to democracy does Donald Trump pose? And one thing that emerged from the interviews, both with Congressman Sean Casten and then also Georgetown law professor David Super, was that this is not a normal moment. Both enthusiastically affirmed that we are in a constitutional crisis. Not that we're creeping up on one, not that we need to be worried about one in the future. Nope, we are in a constitutional crisis. And the fact that both of them thought that, I think, is very, very telling. After the show on Friday, I was chatting briefly with Patty Vasquez before her show, and we both noted just how heavy all of this is. The seriousness of it, if it weighs on you. And the reality is that I think for all of us, we've never lived through a moment like this. It would be easy to look away, to be distracted, but we can't. We can't look away. Part of our responsibility as citizens is to understand the moment, like what's going on? What are they trying to do? Because it's easy for a democracy to sleepwalk into authoritarianism. That's one thing that we know. And we also know it's something that the Trump administration is trying to do. They're trying to distract us. They're trying to overwhelm us. They're trying to flood the zone with so much information that we're not able to see the patterns that are playing out. All right, so the second thing we need to do after diagnosing the problem is developing a strategy for responding. And if there's a theme for today's show, that might be it, thinking through the response. And there are a lot of them out there right now. Recently, James Carville, the famous Democratic operative, he's been getting some attention for an op-ed that he wrote in the New York Times, where he argued that it was time for the Democratic Party to play possum, to roll over and play dead. I'm going to read you just a short section of that op-ed. And so Carville says, quote, with no clear leader to voice our opposition and no control in any branch of government, it's time for Democrats to embark on the most daring political maneuver in the history of our party. Roll over and play dead. Allow the Republicans to crumble beneath their own weight and make the American people miss us. Only until the Trump administration has spiraled into the low 40s or high 30s in public approval polling percentages should we make like a pack of hyenas and go for the jugular. Until then, I'm calling for a strategic political retreat. Now, this is an interesting, unconventional. Carville is certainly thinking outside the box, but ultimately I remain unconvinced. And part of the reason I don't support this approach is something that Sean Casten said last Friday in our conversation. I asked him a question about what the Democratic Party should be doing. And he pushed back a bit. And he said, we need to elevate the conversation above partisanship, suggesting that this isn't about Democrats or Republicans. This is American citizens pushing back against tyranny. He called for us all to embrace our Winston Churchill and to not be Joe Manchin. So, hey, Paul, can we play that clip? Because I think it's the first one is really, really powerful. Talk about what you see as the messaging or the focus the party needs to embrace moving forward. Are there certain ideas that you think are better for the party as it thinks about the midterm and the next presidential election?
So everybody's asking the question, but I think we have to elevate this conversation above partisanship as much as we can. We are in a moment where I think anybody in public office needs to be, for lack of a better word, Churchillian. Mm-hmm. We need to be making it very clear to the American people, this is the stakes of what's going on right now. This is the consequences of what happens if we don't fix it quickly. I make no promise that if we fight, we will succeed. I need to be very clear-eyed about what the consequences and the potential costs of that fight are. But I can guarantee you that if we don't fight, we will lose this 250-year-old experiment. And I think to the extent that any of us in public service, and I think our governor, J.B. Pritzker, is doing a very good job of that. We've tried in our way to do that where we can. But I think getting that out there and reminding people that we're all in this together and that we all have a vested interest in the outcome is how we get through this. As I've said to some of my Democratic colleagues who are more inclined to listen, when the world needs Churchill, don't serve up a plate of Manchin.
That's a powerful message. That last line is really, really powerful. It is. So, a couple things to sort of suss out there. One, Casten says, I guarantee if we don't fight, we will lose this 250-year experiment with democracy. That might be the most compelling argument for action. If we do nothing, we increase the chances that the anti-democratic forces succeed in their efforts. Also, the idea that we need to elevate the conversation and the effect or the fight for democracy has to move away from simply being a battle over partisanship. I think that's also really, really compelling and ultimately correct. And I think the better argument over James Carville, he leveled a devastating criticism on Democratic politicians who've not stood up for the fight for democracy. And I think that's the Joe Manchin critique. So also at a macro level, Casten is reminding us that it's not just the politicians in Washington who have a role, but individuals like us. Now, there's a second audio clip from that interview. He talks about courage is contagious. And I think this is also something that we need to remember. Paul, can we play that one as well?
Our founders created a government that was predicated not only on making sure that we put people of virtue into elected office, but also that we trust that the people who elect them are also virtuous and will do their duty. And I continue to believe the overwhelming majority of Americans are good and decent people. They're a little scared right now, but I think this is an opportunity to recognize that the fear that is contagious when we see people cower down in the face of a bully and we think, boy, I don't want to stand up or he might come after me. The flip side of that is that courage is also contagious.
Yeah.
And, we saw it, if you look back to the civil rights era, it wasn't because, a member of Congress gave a great speech. It was because people on the ground said, I'm going to demonstrate with righteous virtue the right thing to do. And that courage becomes infectious. Right. Just a few years ago, when the Parkland students showed that same kind of courage, and all of a sudden people were marching in the streets. I'm not saying Congress doesn't have a role here. I'm just saying that all of us have agency in demonstrating what is good and true and being loud about that and reminding everybody that we are fundamentally good people, but we've all got to acknowledge the stakes and we got to be loud.
I couldn't agree more with this. And it's part of the reason why I appreciate the insights of Sean Casten so much. He's just such a really, really smart guy, but he has a good perspective on history and what's playing out in the democracy right now. We are in a dangerous moment, but we are not powerless. I'm happy to think through this more with you if you're interested. And while I very much enjoy the analysis of James Carville, he's a fun guy, I don't think it's time to roll over and play dead. I'm with Sean Casten. It's time to stand up as citizens, as Democrats, as Republicans, as political scientists, and to fight for democracy. All right, we got to get to a break, but we will be right back after this on WCPT.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We've been thinking and talking about how we can understand and respond to this precarious moment we find ourselves in. Before we continue with that, I just want to remind everybody that tonight from 5 to 7, Patty Vasquez will be joined by Warren Price and Peter Sorales of Source Solar. Positivity expert and podcaster Jen Zanotti, with some motivational Monday advice, Lori Hawkins, chair of the Kenosha County Democratic Party, who will be talking about the Bernie Sanders rally last Friday night in Kenosha. Hawkins was one of the speakers there. And Maddie Figgs and Benita Cententillanes, who will be in with a women's health segment, Driving It Home with Patty Vasquez, weeknights from 5 to 7 on WCPT 820. All right. So we are going to open the phone lines. I'm going to have a few more thoughts to share, but let's get those calls in. We can talk about anything on your mind. If you want to talk about the war in Ukraine or Trump being president for life or anything else going on right now, absolutely feel free to call in. If you don't normally call into the show, or maybe your first time caller, I encourage you to pick up the phone. I'd love to hear from you. So pick up those phones and text lines. And I've said this before when I fill in for Joan, but I really enjoy chatting with everybody, kicking these ideas around. So, all right, the other thing that I've been thinking about and wanted to talk with you about is what we've been witnessing over the last week or 10 days on the foreign policy front. In particular, the U.S. position on Ukraine, the Ukraine war, but also all the chaos surrounding tariffs and everything else. Today, we've seen that the markets are all over the place. And while it may seem like forever ago, it was just a little over a week ago when Trump had that fateful meeting with Zelensky in the Oval Office. Since then, the United States has suspended military aid to Ukraine and halted its intelligence sharing, effectively cutting off the flow of vital information that has helped the Ukrainian military hold back the Russian invasion. That is a big deal. Meanwhile, the United States has also launched a trade war on its closest friends and biggest trading partners in Canada and Mexico. And let's not forget that Trump demanded Denmark sell it Greenland and that Panama hand over the Panama Canal. The Trump administration has moved to withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization as we think about pandemics and the role of the United States in sharing information, all of that. It has ended foreign aid, or at least 83% of that foreign aid, including USAID. I mean, a fundamental shift in how the United States embraces the world. And maybe most bizarrely, and this is really what I wanted to share with you, the United States this last week voted against the United Nations resolution calling for the creation of an International Day of Hope. So that day is going to be July 12th moving forward. But let me just spend a minute on this vote against an International Day of Hope. Now, the United Nations, this is at the General Assembly, it is a non-binding resolution, meaning the United States has not committed itself to anything other than acknowledging that July 12th will be an International Day of Hope. I'm going to read you some of the language from the resolution at the end, like the most important part, what it's calling for. It says, recognizing the relevance of hope and well-being as universal goals and aspirations in the lives of human beings around the world and the importance of their recognition in public policy objectives. So that's very, very benign. The United States, so all this was doing is calling on the United States to recognize that hope and well-being are universal goals and aspirations of human beings around the world. The Trump administration delegate to the United States said, quote, the text contains references to diversity, equity, and inclusion that conflict with U.S. policies that seek to eliminate all forms of discrimination and create equal opportunities for all. He went on to say, quote, in a world that faces many challenges, funding and effort should be allocated to critical causes and crises rather than an International Day of Hope. Let me give a little bit of context on this. The United States was the only state in the entire United Nations to vote against this. That means China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they all voted to create an International Day of Hope. The United States stood alone against hope. That seems pretty dark, right? So if we step back and we see that over the course of a few short weeks, the Trump administration has enacted nothing short of a revolution in U.S. foreign policy. The United States, who has structured and shaped the post-World War II world order, is now upending alliances and 80 years of bipartisan foreign policy consensus. Max Boot, who's a foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Post, wrote today that this is the most startling U-turn in the history of U.S. foreign policy. And I think that is spot on. Now, if you're trying to understand all of this, it's helpful to think back to how Trump approaches business, his approach to business interactions throughout his long career. And we know something about that. And the one thing we see here is that Trump approached everything as a zero-sum game. In every single business interaction he had, there was a winner and there was a loser. And your job, according to Trump, was to squeeze the most out of the other side. And that's the only way to win. To crush and exploit and screw over anyone who is in your way. There have been so many stories written about his business career and showing this to be true. Not paying contractors, screwing over little guys. He sort of embraces that role. That's something that he has done. That's how he approached business. It was a win-lose relationship where nobody who interacted with Trump ever wanted to do business with him again. Why would you? I think what we're now seeing is that he's bringing this approach to foreign policy with absolutely disastrous results. Now, last week, Thursday, this was pointed out in what I thought to be a really, really thoughtful explanation of Donald Trump's foreign policy by the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. I'm going to play you a little audio of him talking about the difference between win-win and win-lose foreign policy. And I think Justin Trudeau understands Trump's approach and this idea, but I don't think it works for foreign policy. Hey, Paul, can we go to that Justin Trudeau clip?
America first happens best when Canadians and Mexicans are prospering as well. That a win-lose between us would actually be worse for them than a win-win. That's true in international trade, in relations between nation states. It perhaps is not true in real estate deals. That a win-lose is probably better for someone who is experienced in business deals than a win-win. But when it comes to countries, win-wins are actually the best outcomes. And that is an argument that we've continued to make many times and that I've personally made many times with the president. And there is no better example of that than the extraordinary success we have created, Canadians and Americans together, in the most successful economic partnership in the history of the world.
This explains so much of Trump's actions of late. The way in which he's interacted with Zelensky, with Canada, with Europe, with Mexico. Trump doesn't value long-standing allies or relationships. How he approaches the foreign policy is the same way he approached business. It was about screwing over everybody, right? There's no way to create a win-win situation. Yet if we look at what the United States has done over the last 80 years since the end of World War II, it has built one of the most extensive economic and security alliances in the world. And it did so by creating a rules-based international order where everybody interacted with each other and tried to foster win-win relationships. And you know who benefited most from that reality? It was the United States, economically and security alliances. Now, certainly Europe and other parts of the world also benefited from the global trade network the United States created and the security alliance that it created in Europe and elsewhere around the world. But the United States also did as well. And while we should never suggest that the United States is perfect, certainly we have warts and have committed mistakes over time. But on balance, the United States has been a force for good in the world. It doesn't always meet those goals. And we can think of many examples, whether it's Iraq or Vietnam, or again, there's a long list of times where the United States did not live up to its expectations. But in general, The United States has tried to be on the right side of history. And when we think about all of these foreign issues, many of them are pretty clear-cut. The war in Ukraine, a lot of international politics is gray. It's hard to say that there's black and white, but in this instance, I think there is black and white. There's right and wrong. And the United States and Ukraine are on the right side of this, and Russia's on the wrong side. Although what we're seeing out of Trump is an effort to pull the United States and fundamentally upend that worldview. And I think that it's just so dramatic as we think about what's happening on the U.S. foreign policy front. Economic alliances, security alliances that have been in place since World War II. In the course of a couple weeks, Donald Trump has upended that international system. And there is going to be dramatic fallout from these choices across Europe and the world. What we saw over the last couple days is Germany is reaching out to France and the United Kingdom to ask, would they be included in their nuclear umbrella? So for years, decades, the United States has said, we will protect Europe. We will protect Germany, that you don't have to worry about developing your own nuclear weapons. The United States will do that. And now what we're seeing is Germany doesn't believe that commitment. And so they're reaching out to other allies. We might see the same thing in Asia, where Japan and South Korea have avoided developing nuclear weapons because they believe the United States would protect them. Well, what's likely to happen in the future? Can South Korea, can Japan believe that the United States is really their long-standing ally? Would Donald Trump come to their defense? Maybe, maybe not. World politics all over the world is going to shift because of these changes that have been made over the last couple of weeks. It is so dramatic. All right, we got to get to a break here, but when we come back, we're going to go to the phone lines. So remember, that number is 773-763-9278. If you want to talk about domestic politics, foreign policies, Donald Trump, whatever it is, come back and we will chat with you on WCPT.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We've got the phone lines open and the text lines are open. So if you want to call and chat about something, please give us a call at 773-763-9278. Before we go to the phone lines, that's going to remind everybody that tomorrow on Choose Views, Richard Chu will be here taking your calls and talking to Illinois State Rep Maurice West, Mother Jones reporter Abby Vasulis, and Mario Cooper and Elia Mejia, co-executive directors at the Center for Popular Democracy. Choose Views, weekdays from 6 to 8 a.m. Central on WCPT, Chicago's progressive talk for 20 years. All right, let's go to the phone lines. Let's start with Jim from Chicago. Hey, Jim, how are you? Nope, Jim, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm sorry, Professor. My thought is statecraft is being replaced by stagecraft. Take Hungary, for instance. They control 85% of the media there, the television, radio, and internet. And these are all thieves. And with the money, they just buy the internet and the TV, radios, and so on and so forth. They keep pumping out the same propaganda. If you're homosexual, we'll shoot you, and so on and so forth. But we'll steal as much money as we can. Now you look at this nut in the White House. The other day was just as much as I can stomach that face, that hideous face is. He's being interviewed in the White House, and he stares. He looks over the reporter's eye, and he catches the camera's eye, knowing full well, because he's been on The Apprentice for years, and he knows that the only thing that matters is the way he looks. It's nothing to do with what he thinks or what he does. But this is what we're up against in the world today. It's stagecraft. It's people that think they can control the media, the internet, the radio, and force their we can steal.
That's
really what they really want to steal. That's what they really. They're thieves. They're just common thieves. But they won't admit that.
No, one of the things. one of the things that I think that, this is really interesting because, on Friday you were talking about operas, right? And today we're talking about statecraft. You come with these good metaphors. It's really, really useful. And I think you're right. It's about the optics. Trump wants to create an impression about how things look. And he wants to dominate the media with outrage and have everybody talking about him. But it's not about good governance, right? I mean, that's the thing. Joe Biden was one of the presidents who really cared about governing. How do we try to make the world a little bit better every single day? And it wasn't as much about the optics or the statecraft, right? In some ways, Joe Biden probably needed to be much better on that front, right? Better salesperson, but really, yeah.
But anyway, Professor, remember this. He got 81 million votes. That was the highest Democratic vote total in our history. So he wasn't that bad of a candidate. The problem was the problem is the Democratic Party hasn't taken the stage in that regard. They've got to take the stage in the internet, the radio, and television.
No,
and apparently television is so frightened to death of Trump suing them that they can't put one syllable out that is against them.
No, I've
never seen like this in my life. Biden wasn't on the camera every day when he said something. This guy's on camera every single day.
He dominates the news. You're absolutely right.
Why though? The only reason he's right is some reason the 72 million people or whatever voted for him. He must have some appeal. He must have some insane appeal. But I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is, Professor. But I'll go to my grave never figuring that one out.
Well,
anyway,
I think there's two things at play here, and one you're highlighting already, which is fear. I think some of the networks, whether we're talking about the TV networks or print journalism, they're afraid. I mean, we're seeing this. I think most notably, we've seen this out of ABC News, who settled with him for millions of dollars. I think we're seeing this out of the Washington Post, who continues, where we're seeing, Bezos influence that process and what the op-eds look like. And I think they're afraid of being targeted by the president because they know what he can do. So again, some of it is really operating out of fear. I think there's also the other element of it is Trump is good for news, right? He's interesting to watch, whether you love him or hate him. He attracts eyeballs, right? And to your point, he knows how to command the camera, right? And so you're right. Democrats have to get better. They have to think about how do we put ourselves in that position as well.
Did you watch The Apprentice? Did you ever watch The Apprentice?
I did. In fact, I remember watching that first season and being some degree captivated, right? I mean, Donald Trump is good in those mediums.
I wasn't. Maybe he was good to you, but I'd have to be on Demerol to watch that, and I'd unplug it immediately. The preposterous notion that he's going to give somebody a job.
Yeah.
I mean, I know what his history is. I know that he was plucked out of the atmosphere by Barbara Walters. She started putting him on TV back in whenever the heck it was. And what his appeal was, I don't know, because he was a real estate salesman or what? I mean, what kind of appeal is that? I know plenty of real estate salesmen. I don't want to look at them on TV.
No.
Anyway,
right.
enough. You got a lot of callers. Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
I always appreciate it, Jim. Thanks for calling in. Yeah, no, Jim always has. Again, last Friday he was talking about opera, and today he's talking about stagecraft. And I like that Jim sees the big picture to all of this. So we're just checking out the text line here. We're getting some texts coming in. We've got somebody from Washington who texts in. We are in the era of bread and circuses, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? That we are Donald Trump is very effective at driving the media cycle, controlling the news cycle, even if it is outrageous, right? He keeps people paying attention, and that's not particularly good for good governance. So let's go to John in Marengo, who wants to talk about Trump and farmers. Hey, John, how are you?
Hey, good afternoon, Professor. How are you holding up today?
Hey, the weather is nice outside. That it's up in the 60s, right? It gives you a little bit. I think the politics are dark, but the weather is bright. So I'm trying to get a balance there. How about you?
I'm doing great. I'm a farmer out here in Marengo, and it is a beautiful day out here. But I just want to inform the public about the real dangers and what's happening with farmers and the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah.
This is really a travesty. One of the programs within the Inflation Reduction Act was to get farmers to mitigate climate change by planting cover crops and implementing friendly practices towards the soil and the environment by using less fertilizer, which 90% of it comes from fossil fuels. And anyhow, how our program worked locally here was by the DeLong Company. They buy most of the grain in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, and I give them all the credit in the world. They applied for this USDA grant, and they were able to secure 675,000 acres were protected in our area. And to put things into perspective, the Cook County Forest Preserve District only owns 70,000 acres.
Okay.
And so you could see about 7 to 8 times the amount of land that right now is sucking up all the pollution and all the carbon right now is going into the soil where it belongs, and we're getting better and healthier food because of this.
Yeah.
Now the kicker is we haven't been paid for doing this. And because Trump's got the holds on this, and we as farmers are counting on this money so that we can go ahead and pay our loans from last year. And it's just absolutely so sad and devastating because the general public doesn't know about it and the good work that it's doing. And we, for pennies on the acre, the good work that we're doing.
Has there been any communication from the Trump administration about when those payments might be coming, or are they at least trying to stay in contact about what might happen, or is everybody just worried?
No, they had, when the new Secretary of Agriculture came into office, she made an announcement that they were going to release $20 million. And there's over $20 billion that's out there that we're waiting for.
Wow.
And it's repulsive. And the also travesty was last fiscal year, the Dems were negotiating with the Republicans for the extension of the Farm Bill. There was $10 billion left over of Inflation Reduction Act money that the Republicans just decided, no, we don't want anything to do with it, and just let the whole thing go. And that's money that could have been used for conservation, money that could have been used for the SNAP program, and they've just decided to let the whole thing go. And we as farmers are just getting destroyed by it.
This is really, really interesting, John, because you're right. This is sort of the conversation that's not happening. So what happens? Like if the Trump administration decides we're just simply not going to fill this commitment, what does that mean for farmers? Like at a practical level, what would it mean for you? What would it mean for other farmers as well? What are we talking about?
Well, the practical letters is right now it's the springtime, and we have to pay for rent. Coming in for the year. I haven't been able to close my books last year. I'm paying interest right now, and I'm having a hard time coming up with the interest payment because this is money that was geared for us. And, the analogy I've been telling my friends is if I were a heating and air conditioning repairman and I went to my local high school and I fixed their furnace, well, and there was an election for the school board and there was a whole new school board that came in, well, guess what? I'm still due the money that I did to fix the furnace.
Sure.
And we as farmers, we've gone ahead and we've sequestered the carbon. We've done our job on that end, and we need to get paid for this. And the other sad thing, too, is that because of these practices, this was the caveat to get us into renewable biofuels for airline fuel. And this is going to be a huge job creator for people here in Illinois. And because we're doing these practices, we're carbon neutral. And electric cars are fantastic. We need them. But at the same time, we're not going to be able to put batteries in an airplane and get them to take off.
Sure.
So this is the perfect fit for us for that next generation of fuel. And it's just an absolute travesty.
It feels like, that the previous legislation is really thinking about how do we transition into a more carbon neutral place? How do we involve farmers in all of that? And then when the incoming government doesn't pick up their responsibility, it all collapses. Trump talks about how the farmers love him. Do you have a sense? Do you think farmers would ultimately turn on Donald Trump? Everybody has, a lot of this is about identity politics, but at the end of the day, it's also about day-to-day living. What's your sense of where the farm political views might be these days?
I think that farmers, I'm going to put it to you this way. I really do believe that Secretary Vilsack was an outstanding Secretary of Agriculture, but they did a terrible job of marketing the program. If you listen to any person in Trump's cabinet, every other word is Donald Trump is doing X, Y, Z. And those programs that were able to keep us above water, they never took credit for it. And it was just like, oh, it's just USDA money. It's just USDA money. It doesn't matter. And Trump at least says the word farmer, and he's built a really strong coalition on it. The biggest problem I think that will happen to agriculture, and I hope the Dems will run with this, is when they start taking away the Affordable Care Act. Mm-hmm. Because the Affordable Care Act has been the best thing for family farmers because it's enabled people to be able to go back to the farm full time and not have to have a cruddy job that they don't want to necessarily have because they need the benefits.
This is really, really interesting, John. I really appreciate you calling in. You've educated us all on the Trump effect on farming. I think this is really, really important. And I hear hopes that the administration does the right thing and follows through with that legislation, right? I mean, throughout U.S. history, when new presidents came in, they always followed the legislation that was passed under the previous president. And it's like you said, it's despicable that they're not thinking about that.
Right. And can I just one real quick thing? I just want to thank Governor Pritzker for calling out this hypocrisy. And tomorrow, the Illinois House Dems are hosting an event for farmers where we can come and vent to the problems of what's happening to the USDA and the problems that are going to happen with SNAP benefits, which is the old food stamp program. So I just want to thank everybody downstate and the local Dems in Illinois who are going out there and trying and for giving us a voice. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for calling in, John. Really, really thoughtful call there. And I think appreciate John's perspective there because he's talking about the difference between politics, right? And Donald Trump does a good job of politicking and talking about how he cares for the farmers, but he's not doing a particularly good job about governing, right? And again, we see this difference between Democrats and Republicans where oftentimes Democrats really get in the nitty-gritty and are thinking about governing. How do we make lives better? I mean, Barack Obama has talked about that during his administration each and every day. Let's think about how do we tack forward? How do we make small incremental changes? But that's very, very different from what we're seeing out of the Trump administration. It goes back to Jim's point where this is all about stagecraft. It's all about creating the optics. And actually, we've had a couple texters who call in who really liked both John and Jim's point there. One texter from Chicago says, what a great call, essential listening. Thanks for calling in to WCPT. So, no, I think this is a really, really important point here is to think through good governance and the ways in which the Trump administration is using a chainsaw to cut the government, to cut back government plans, whether we're talking about farmers or we're seeing the same thing with foreign aid, where Marco Rubio made a comment today that I think the final number was 83% of aid has been cut. And that's such an important global dynamic, and that impacts lives all over the world. And I think it's very, very short-sighted as we think about all these developments. All right, we're going to get back to some more of your calls after this quick little break. If you want to call in, again, that number is 773-763-9278. We will be right back on WCPT.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are taking calls for the next 45 minutes. So if you want to call in, actually, this is a good time to call. We don't have a ton of callers. So this is, if you've got some thoughts to share about Donald Trump or the democracy or what Democrats are up to, please call in. We'd love to hear you. Before we get back to the callers, I want to remind everybody that tomorrow during this time slot, Turi Ryder will be here talking Michelle Keller, Senior Director at Farm to Veteran, David Levine, Professor at the University of California College of the Law, San Francisco, Illinois State Representative Han Nguyen, Stephanie Riley, founder of Black Rose Defense on teaching women how to legally use firearms, and Dr. Jennifer Grant, infectious disease expert at Endeavor Health on the measles outbreak. That's live, local, progressive weekdays from 2 to 5 p.m. WCPT, Chicago's progressive talk for 20 years. All right, let's go back to the phone lines. We've got Dave from Hoffman Estates. Hey, Dave, how are you today?
Professor, the listening that, do you recall, too, though, remember President Biden, he only took like about 10 press conferences in his whole hitch, in his 4 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then maybe he should have went up and, and kind of touted what he'd done, might have helped.
I think about that. Remember how during Trump's first term, Trump every single day would go out and talk about the stock market and how great the stock market was, even though we know the stock market is only sort of loosely connected to a presidential administration. And Joe Biden didn't do that. And I think he even regretted it. He said, maybe I should have gone out and done all those silly things. And maybe that's just what the political world needs today. So, but you were going to say something else. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, and when you had the one texter wrote you and said bread and circuses, I ain't heard that one since James Ward.
That's right. Yes.
And one last thing with Trump here, that why don't they call him Captain Phony Spurs instead of Bone Spurs? Phony Spurs, because he never had them,
Yes,
and,
yes.
What I was going to talk to was, where they say about, history may not repeat, but it rhymes, is Ukraine. It was done. This was done before with Russia attacked Finland in 39 and 40, the Winter War.
Yes.
And then again, they had that continuation war in 44. But part of the deal, they had to rid themselves of the Germans on their soil, and they lost Karelia, that eastern portion. They still have never got, along with various other areas. And then the reparations to Russia were both. The Winter War and continuation were enormous, but the Finns paid them.
Yes.
The stoic reasoning was the East took our men, the Germans took our women, the Swedes took our children, but at least we are left with our war debt.
Yeah.
And but yeah, they paid the war debt. And if I recall right, my mother was also proud too. They're the only ones that ever paid the U.S. The war debt for World War I.
No, that's absolutely right. And that took a long, long time. And I think to your point, history doesn't repeat, but sometimes it rhymes. I love that quote. And I think if we look back, it's easy to forget how relatively peaceful the world has been since World War II. You read any history, go read history prior to World War II and go all the way back sort of to this era of great power politics that Trump likes to talk about so much. There was way more great power conflict, and there was way more death and destruction. There was way more economic inequality, right? What we saw after World War II, the United States, imperfections at all, really created a global trading system, and it created a security blanket around the world that tamped down conflict. It doesn't mean there wasn't war, but its effect was really, really important. And we throw that away at our peril, right? Because as you noted, all of those things can happen again. Russia's ambitions haven't changed. There's a lot of great power politics playing out in Asia right now. So no, I think you're absolutely right that if we read a little bit of history, upending this system is not likely to be positive.
Yeah, unlike Ukraine, Finland really didn't get a whole lot of help from like the U.S. or France or England. If it was very, very late when it didn't matter no more. But I think in Ukraine is going to probably, when all is said and done, they're going to have to give up that eastern portion of with Donbass and Crimea to sue for peace.
I think that's probably the reality, and it was likely going to probably move that way anyhow. But think about how the Trump administration's shift and embrace of Russia has made that so much easier now, right? I mean, Ukraine is really in a desperate position. They don't have the ability to argue. When the war started, Zelensky was very clear that all of that territory should be returned, including Crimea, and he's right.
Yeah.
In a post-World War II aggressive war is unacceptable, and they should be held accountable. But now, if you're Ukraine, you probably have to sue for peace, and you probably have to trade off. But then you need some sort of security agreement that protects the long-term, viability of the state of Ukraine. So it's, we're moving into very, very dangerous territory.
Yeah, because Ukraine's got a lot of casualties too, and they're not the universal soldier. And you got to call it quits at some point, just to save these people.
It's a brutal war. I mean, it's again reminiscent. You mentioned World War I. It's reminiscent of that. It's just individuals going into the meat grinder, and I think absolutely Ukraine would like some sort of peace agreement, but it has to be a long-term security agreement. So we see the difference between a ceasefire, and that's what Trump talks about all the time. Ceasefire. I want a ceasefire. I want a ceasefire. But ceasefires are only effective if there's also a long-term security agreement, something there that holds them together. And right now, that's not the case. And I think what Trump probably wants is he wants a ceasefire so that he can say, I deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, and then call it a day. But that's, if you're Ukraine, you can't agree to that. I mean, the United States has pledged to help Ukraine going all the way back to the end of the Cold War. The agreement between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for security. So, there's so many pieces at play here.
Yep. And the final, so you can get to others, is they had that Christian Amanpour was interviewing Finland's president, Stubb, and they were talking about that, and he says, obviously they're hated enemies anyway with the Russians, but he said you cannot trust Putin. He said he's broken these words or promises like 25 times. So he said that you cannot trust this man. So anyway, I just thought I'd share those few tidbits with you, and thanks for giving me the time, Professor, and perhaps again we'll talk with you.
Absolutely, Dave. I appreciate you calling in. It's always, I love talking about foreign policy, so that's really, really fantastic stuff. So thanks for your time and thoughts on the world of politics these days. Let's jump we got Steve down on the Gold Coast. Hey, Steve, how are you today?
Fine, thank you. And you already touched on a few of the issues I wanted to address, and you're absolutely correct. We live in two different worlds, the world before World War II and the world after World War II. Before World War II, beginning in the early 19th century until the Second World War, you had numerous wars of territorial aggression. After the Second World War, we still have conflicts around the world, but it's not the case that people are invading other people in order to seize their land and so forth, because you would become isolated politically, economically, socially, all sorts of ways. In addition to which, you talk about regimes and international order and so forth. So, these things didn't exist. If Great Britain wanted to seize something in the middle of the 19th century, okay, somebody might write an article or complain about it, but what else was to be done?
Exactly, yes.
Yes, and that's important. I will push back slightly on some of the things that people have said with regard to, the Democrats could have done a better job messaging and so forth. Yes, in a media landscape of 20 years ago, that might be the case. But in today's media landscape where people have cut the cable cord, they're not subscribing to, the reliable, credible media outlets, newspapers that we used to, rely upon. Instead, they're getting their, news from, let's face it, places that tell them what they already believe. Confirmation bias defines the modern media landscape. So, no matter how many news conferences Joe Biden might have had, the only thing that was going to happen was Newsmax was going to splice up that news conference and, give you some of the flubs that Joe would have made, and then basically exclude everything else that was relevant to you. And because you're not willing to watch anything else other than Newsmax and Fox, and something that Charlie Kirk is putting out, then you were never going to know what that policy was. It was going to be framed for you in a way that it was going to be made to look negative. When the election happened in November of 2024, about half of Americans thought we were in the midst of a recession in this country. I mean, talk about detachment from reality.
It's such a good point, right? And I think about what was so successful about Trump and that messaging, and specifically those media outlets, is that we're talking about low information and low engagement voters, right? So it's easy to reach those with that type of messaging, right? The simple populist message that, we're going to fix it day one. It'll be so much better. The prices of eggs are going down. I don't know if Harris or Biden could have made that kind of argument, right? I mean, it's just sort of an empty populist message. And you're absolutely right that, I think in some ways, Harris and Biden deserve more credit than they get for that campaign. I think it actually was a pretty good campaign, and they got kind of caught up in a broader dynamic that was I think bigger than what they saw.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a downside as far as Democrats go, it's that, that they adhere more so to reality than Republicans, especially the MAGA crowd when it comes to running for office. Hillary Clinton in 2016 went to coal country and said, look, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that we're going to bring back your grandfather's jobs. Yeah. These jobs are gone. We need to retrain you. You can do other sorts of work. Trump went in there and told them, oh, no, we're going to bring you back all those jobs, even more. Yeah. Well, guess what? That never happened. You had a caller who talked about, what was happening with regard to the agricultural sector. Yes. Donald Trump had to, vis-a-vis the Department of Agriculture, in terms of a fund that they had to pay out $30 billion in order to bail out farmers that were suffering as a result of his first administration's exercise in tariffs. Yep. And that fund is almost entirely depleted. So I don't know where he's going to get the money this time, other than again asking Congress for more money for this process. So this is why you're seeing in deep red districts, congressmen saying, that whole town hall meeting, we're not going to be doing that anymore.
Right. They're running from it. Because exactly. I'm a bit surprised that the implications have come so quickly, right? We're 50 days in, and we're already seeing, on the foreign policy front, things are falling apart. On the economic front, we're now talking about recession, right? Elections have consequences, but even given that, it is hard to ruin an economy in a matter of weeks. Absolutely. It is hard to undermine 80 years of foreign policy in 6 weeks, and we've seen them be able to do both of those. And you're absolutely right. And we're up against the break here. We got to go. But I think your point about prior to World War II is also so important. We're living in a far from perfect world, but a world that was very, very different prior to World War II. So thanks for calling in, Steve. I always love talking to another political scientist, and you always have such a really thoughtful way of organizing thoughts. So we got to get to a break here. We will be right back with more callers after this.
Live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We have the phone lines open now until 3:30, and we actually just have a couple callers. So if you want to get a call in before that break, absolutely give us a ring at 773-763-9278. Also, before we get back to callers, want to do our Team Hochberg message. So if you're looking to purchase a new home or refinance your existing home, you need to do what Joan did and call Team Hochberg, your trusted local lender with over 500 five-star Google reviews. Kathy, 60, a nurse who lives in a $600,000 home, called Team Hochberg for a free consultation to consolidate the over $30,000 she had accumulated on her credit cards after her husband passed away. After speaking with David, Kathy posted this 5-star Google review. Quote, David was very helpful. He didn't try to sell me anything. He advised me to keep my current mortgage because of my low rate. He offered me excellent advice, was very patient, kind, and knowledgeable. I highly recommend his services to anyone looking for a mortgage or any financial expertise. Quote, if you'd like this type of 5-star experience on your next mortgage, do what Joan did and call Team Hochberg at 855-563-2843 or 56david.com. David's helped Joan and thousands of WCPT listeners, but he can't help you if you don't call. 855-563-2843 or 56david.com. Lower.com, equal housing lender, NMLS 1124061. All right, let's get back to the callers. We've got Dan in Dubuque who wants to talk a little bit more about Ukraine. Hey, Dan, how are you doing?
Well, I'm frustrated and angry, like a lot of folks. But what I'm frustrated and angry about is all this equivocation and all this, like, well, we have to be realistic. That's how the German people sat around saying, this guy's a clown. We got to be realistic. He's not going to do anything. Mm-hmm. We have to be like Joe Walsh. We have to channel that. Now, I worked for Tammy Duckworth in the previous election and watched Joe Walsh say the following. War hero, man. The woman gave 2 legs and the use of 1 arm to this country. And this guy has become an absolute warrior. And while I have some real problems with his past, he has shown some repentance and has said, this guy's got to go. I don't care what his politics are. He's dangerous. And when we stand around and say things like, well, we have to be realistic, we can't afford realism. We have to dream way higher than that. Ukraine, based on the people who are on the ground, Malcolm Nance and Phil Etner, is not going to lose this war. And in fact, what we're hearing, especially from Malcolm Nance, is the Russians are being decimated in the field. They have conscripts who don't want to fight, and the Ukrainians are fighting on their home property, their homeland. They are relentless. And I think anybody who says, well, what are we going to do? We're going to have 45, 47, whatever his number is today. We'll call him 46.
Yeah.
Wave a piece of paper that's not worth what it says on it. It says we've got peace in our time.
Yeah.
Appeasing a dictator, appeasing a totalitarian, authoritarian type person. I had a person say, well, they have to make peace. They're losing people. They've lost 100,000 plus children to kidnapping, to war crimes, to absolute. But we sit here in our privilege and say, well, the Ukrainians have to be realistic. At what point have all of those Ukrainians who have died in the field and on their streets, their blood doesn't mean anything?
Dan, I'm struck, as the coverage has shifted and Trump has tried to sort of shift the conversation and the position. It was only 3 years ago that we were having very, very different conversations about this. And you're right. We forget what happened. This was an aggressive war. Russia invaded Ukraine. Putin has engaged in clear war crimes. They have, like you've said, they took thousands of children. They have targeted hospitals. They have targeted apartment complexes. Just last week, they hit an apartment complex and they waited for the police and fire to show up, and they hit it again, right? I mean, so this is, again, there's a lot of gray in international politics, but this is an example of black versus white, right versus wrong, and Russia is wrong. And it is frustrating to see how effective Trump has tried to be at shifting that narrative. And again, it's unfortunate, and you're right that we need more politicians pushing back. I would suggest there needs to be more pushback within the Republican Party too, because a lot of those Republicans are anti-Russian hawks, and they seem to have just fallen over.
Well, if we're going to wait for the Republicans to come to our rescue, we're in trouble. By the way, if we're going to wait for any politician to come to our rescue, we're in trouble.
No, I think...
We absolutely desecrate the memory of our founding fathers, the Minutemen, the militiamen, who, while they were not very effective, did win that war with the help of, by the way, France. Mm-hmm. Shout out to Freedom Fries and that foolishness. Honestly, we cannot depend. There's no one coming. It's us. It's we the people. The darn thing about democracy is a two-edged sword. We can live in our rights, but we also have responsibilities. I got people online calling taxation as theft and no taxation without representation when they have a vote every 2 years. Mm-hmm. And more often if you include local elections. I am sick to death of American people saying, freedom ain't free, but I don't want to pay my taxes. It's okay for 20-year-olds to go to some foreign land to die, mm-hmm. but not pay my taxes. That's where...
Go ahead.
I apologize, but it's us. It's we the people.
Well, and I think that argument works. I mean, you're talking about Ukraine, but it works at both a domestic and an international level, right? I mean, we're talking about mobilizing individuals to push back at what we're seeing play out in the American political system, but also thinking about what's happening in Ukraine. And you're right to say that this is, it's really unconscionable what we're doing to Ukraine, especially cutting off the military aid and cutting off the intelligence data as well. I mean, that it's making that war more difficult and forcing them to accept a position of surrender, right? It really is. It goes against everything that the United States has standed for, going all the way back in history. And I as much as you're right to say, I'm not surprised Republicans aren't standing up. I mean, somebody like Marco Rubio, who I was talking about on Friday, in particular, I mean, he has been a forceful defender of Ukraine and a forceful critic of Russia until he became Secretary of State, and then he just sinks into that couch. And it really is a terrible position to be in.
It's deplorable, it's appalling, and it's disgusting, to use a word that 47 uses. bottom line is, by the way, I don't refer to it with any human terms. He has no human succor. He has no empathy. He has no sympathy. He has no human values that are valuable to the United States. We just got rid of a president who was the most empathetic, sympathetic, and understanding man probably we've ever had in that office. And then we go to this. And I apologize for filibustering, but I am. We literally, when we were looking to move from Illinois, I said, I'm tired of being in a safe blue cocoon, because our view of the world is not quite what the world really looks like. We've moved to a red state. That district in Dubuque was blue up until 2020. And we can take it back, because when we toured the area looking at homes, Harris to Trump signs were 8 to 10 to 1 in our neighborhood.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting.
I will never believe that she lost the way she lost.
Well, one other thing.
Something went on.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the perspective, Dan. We're up against the break right here. But the other thing I would say about your. No, worry. I'm so glad your passion came through, and I think you highlight something that's not getting a ton of attention. And I think one other thing that we need to reference as we talk about the Ukraine war, yes, the United States has spent, $120 billion. The amount that Trump throws out, the $350 billion, that's not accurate. The U.S. has spent money there, but most of that money has gone back into the U.S. economy. And the other thing is that Ukraine has not asked for a single U.S. soldier. So they've used U.S. funds, but they have devastated the Russian military in the process, right? So if you could talk about like that relative cost of what the United States has spent to devastate Russia's military, to devastate their economy, to turn Russia into a pariah state, that strikes me as a very, very effective use of U.S. resources. And again, that doesn't get a lot of conversation, but that's a position where Europe is right now, Canada is right now. The United States is alone in that unique position. So, hey, Dan, I got to get to a break. Thanks so much for calling in. Really appreciate your passion, and I feel that frustration. All right, we're going to scoot to a break, and then we've got a couple more calls we'll get to right back after this on WCPT.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We're in our final little segment of callers here before we get to our interview at 3:30. Before we get back to the callers, I want to remind everybody that right now on the Joan Esposito Featured Interviews podcast, you can find and share my recent conversation with Congressman Sean Casten and Georgetown Law's David Super, and Joan's recent conversation with Reps Robin Kelly, Brad Schneider, Michael King, Michael Lux, Tom Hartman, Joel Ostro, Greg Palast, Wisconsin Congressman Mark Pocan, and much more. Joan's featured interviews and full episode podcast are both available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Amazon. Yeah, they're basically everywhere. Search for Joan Esposito or get the links on her show page by visiting heartlandsignal.com and clicking on her picture. So, all right, we've got Robert and Gurney. Welcome to the show, Robert.
How you doing? Thanks for taking my call.
Absolutely.
What I wanted to kind of comment about is this kind of narrative about the legitimate media versus alternative media.
Yeah.
And I think there needs to be a little more of a candid conversation about it. The quote unquote, I'll call it corporate media, people walked away from that specifically because of how it entertained the legitimacy of Trump and the legitimacy of Biden when he sort of sunk into his health issues. And I think I know a lot of people, and I would say these are people that are maybe moderate liberals, that rejected sort of the corporate media because of what they could see right in front of their face.
Sure.
So I think that's one dimension of it. I think on the other side of it, I think this out-of-hand critique that people are listening to a podcaster is necessarily bad. I mean, I've probably for the last 4 to 5 years have sought out intelligent thinkers, be they podcasters or independent journalists, that many of them are published authors. I find that to be far better in terms of framing complex issues, for example, like the two major conflicts that we're dealing with now, Ukraine and Palestine. In order for anybody to understand these conflicts, you've got to get some background history and understand what's going on, because it's sort of couched as if, like, say, take Ukraine, that Putin and Russia just woke up one morning and said, we're going to invade. Mm-hmm. And that is just, that's political immaturity. Ukraine is a result of many years of, let's just say, political competition or geopolitical events. And I think that dismissing independent journalists, independent thinkers outside of the quote-unquote corporate news space, I think it's healthy. And I'll give you an example of one is, just as an example, this is one source I watch, is the Young Turks. I don't agree with everything on there, but they examine things. When they look at a topic, they'll stay on that for 15, 20 minutes, and they'll give you sources. You might have to read an article. Sure. But I'm saying that Americans got to quit having a fast food approach to learning about things, where just someone gives them what they want to hear, or just enough, and they got to be a little more critical. They got to go, wait, what's going on here exactly?
Well, I think this is a really important point, because we speak about the media as if it's one monolithic thing, and the reality is there are a variety of different outlets. Some are very, very good, and some are bad. And what we've seen is the democratization of media. And you're absolutely right. As a fellow podcaster, I think podcasts can play a really useful role, and you can give people information that they couldn't get from the 5:30 news 10 years ago. So you can really explore, you can become an expert in a variety of things, and I think that's really, really healthy for a democracy. But it also requires civic education, right? It requires that we sort of pull the whole country up, because when you democratize the media and you allow all sorts of outlets, it also can play to the lowest common denominator. And so we see both, right? We see podcasts at the upper end of things, which are sort of pulling the discourse and the conversation and elevating it, and we see others that are not, right? And you're right, this is just the landscape that we're operating in now.
And another example I want to give people that I discovered in the last year and a half or so, and pardon me for bringing up X, but on X, for the most part, it's a cesspool of a lot of vulgarity and disgusting stuff. However, they have a feature on there called Spaces, which were sort of like that's kind of like a dial-in conversation platform. What I think is so interesting about that, I have actually participated and been allowed to ask questions of diplomats from other parts of the world. And I recommend to people, that's the only thing that I see that X has that's worthwhile, Spaces, because they're free from the sort of the policing of the Elon Musk, force. And I'm telling you that some of the speakers I've seen on that, I've listened to, I mean, I'm just so impressed that I can ask a diplomat or a politician from England a direct question, and they will give a detailed answer, and there can be follow-up questions. So I'm just saying, people in this listening audience, there's a lot going on outside the quote-unquote corporate or legitimate media, and you need to find out about it, because you'll start looking at things. You go, okay. Don't be so quick to make a decision. You got to kind of think a little bit.
Absolutely right. I mean, you think about the menu of information that is out there is better than any point in human history. If you want to get information, if you want to learn something, if you want to understand, if you want to, like you said, connect with ambassadors or academics or whoever that is, you can do that now. We now have the tools, whether it's social media or whether it's, a variety of media outlets, podcasts, whatnot. Like, you have the ability to learn so much, right? So it's such an opportunity, the democratization of media. But the problem is it works at both ends, right? So we can elevate the discourse. We can have more meaningful conversations about the war in Ukraine and what's going on around the world. But it also enables those who want to pull that conversation down, who want to have in sort of simplistic populist arguments, right? Simple solutions to complex problems. And that doesn't help us, right? And so the challenge is, how do you move that? Oh, go ahead.
Joe Rogan tends to be like that.
Yes.
I from what I understand, that Joe Rogan several years back was considered to be more liberal but I dropped in on one of his podcasts, and he's overly simplistic. He takes, just a basic sort of, maybe populist idea, and he like, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. And it's like, it's not really a great idea. It's just a comment that's very populist,
sure,
and it has some appeal. And realistically, if you really interrogate it, you're going to go, maybe not,
I totally agree. Robert, I got to scoot because we got to get to one more caller before we move on. But thank you so much for calling. I think your perspective on media is really, really useful. All right, we got one more caller. It's Keith On, who wants to talk about the Democrats. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, you spoke that right. Keith On.
All right. Well, welcome to the show.
Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Hey, thanks for calling in. I appreciate that.
I love all the shows. Tom Hartman, Joan Esposito, even Where Are They Now? I listen to all of them.
Good for you.
I have a problem with the fact that everybody says the Democrats sitting on their hands, they're not doing anything, when they've been warning the American public for 8 years that this man is doing this underhanded. And the news is not the news job to inform you of what you need to see and feel and know hear with your own self, but it is up to you to get involved. And news media's job is to make money, to get you to watch their program so they can hire the same oligarchs that are selling you the products that are made in these other countries. Not only that, the Democrats have been fighting, and then you say then they say we're too old. We don't understand the American people when we are the American people. The voters are not the voters of the yesteryear. The voters are the voters now. They listen to their superiors, the professors, the congressmen themselves, the mayors, and if these people are going against the grain, all for the sake of money. Everybody wants to be a millionaire now. Nobody wants to do the work and get paid a normal break. Now everybody wants to go to these big companies and say, my product wasn't delivered right, and I was damaged, and I want to sue for $1 million. And now they have lawyers as people negotiating to the senators about what they should do about anything. So those people don't listen until the people give them money to go up there to give them money so they can listen to us.
The democracy responds to those who show up and vote.
No, democracy responds to those who get involved.
Yes.
You don't necessarily have to vote to be the senator. You can sit on your hands like the Democrats are doing now. Sometimes you have to go through, like Trump says, he got one thing right. Sometimes you have to go through some pains, and that's what your parents tell you. When you can't get that bike for Christmas, you don't stop praying on Santa Claus, or praying on a miracle to get the bike. And Trump got that down to a T. He's not going to deliver anything except his word. And his word that the Democrats have been warning you is for sale.
It is really right. Keith,
everything's for sale.
I got to cut you off, Keith, because we got to get to a break, but I really appreciate you calling in. And
I understand. I appreciate you calling. I appreciate you taking my call.
Absolutely. Thanks for calling in. I really very much appreciate your thoughts on democracy and the way in which the democracy works. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be having a conversation with Professor Robert Rowland of the University of Kansas. We'll be right back just after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are thrilled to be joined by our next guest, Robert Rowland, who is a professor of communication studies at the University of Kansas, where he teaches rhetoric and argumentation. Robert, who goes by Robin, has more than 100 published essays, and he's here today to discuss his most recent book, The Rhetoric of Donald Trump, Nationalist Populism and the American Democracy. Welcome, Robin. Thank you so much for joining us on WCPT.
It's great to be here.
I've been looking forward to this conversation. So one of the really useful observations that I pulled from your book is that, yes, Donald Trump is different. We all get that. We see, that he's different from other politicians. But what's really important is understanding how Trump is different. And your work focuses on Trump's language and rhetoric. And again, even the most casual observer can see that there's something different about how Trump speaks. Yeah, what's so valuable about what you do is that you take a more systematic look at the pattern of Trump's rhetoric. Can you start with a big picture look at what we need to understand about Trump's rhetoric? What patterns do we see? And how is he different from other presidents?
Sure. I think the biggest thing is that most effective presidents try to present a positive message. They focus on activating positive emotions by retelling the American dream and then presenting a vision of policy, an ideology that's consistent with their retelling. And while Ronald Reagan did that with a small government ideology, Barack Obama did that with a pragmatic more government, not big government, but more government. But in terms of their narratives and values, Obama and Reagan are pretty similar, different in policies, but pretty similar. Trump focuses on activating negative emotions, beginning with fear of some group he labels as dangerous. And that fear often morphs into hatred toward that group or hatred toward elites who he depicts as not caring about ordinary people. And so, for example, on any number of occasions in the last campaign, Trump promised to be the retribution for ordinary people getting even with elites who he claimed weren't protecting them. And then he resolves those negative emotions by presenting himself as kind of the strongman, hero, protector of the ordinary people. And one other illustration of how different he is that almost all presidents lay out, coherent policy agendas. Now, some are just better at it than others. Obama and Reagan were quite good at it. Carter and the first President Bush, not as good at it. But they all lay out agendas. And President Trump or candidate Trump never talks about public policy in any kind of detail. He has labels. He makes grandiose claims. But even State of the Union addresses, and we had a State of the Union substitute last week, they look like campaign rallies.
This is really, really interesting. And that you write that Trump's rhetoric is not accidental, right? And some people sort of look at, that's just the way that, the way that he talks. But you argue this is very, very intentional and that he's deploying very classic techniques to build support. You started to talk about that, but can you go a little bit more into the detail, like what type of tactics is he deploying and how does that prove to be so effective?
Right. There are three things he essentially always does. There is a nationalist message, and where he is warning his core supporters who have tended to be in the non-college educated, mostly white, so working class supporters, about some group he depicts as dangerous others. Now, to some extent, he picks what I think sees as targets of opportunity. So the first he began by talking in the first campaign, and he still talks about it more than any other group, about undocumented immigrants, and he focuses on them. Right now, he is also focusing a great deal of his rhetoric on transgender Americans, who he depicts as uniquely dangerous. Now, in all cases, when he talks about these groups, every group has people who do bad things. But the groups he attacks, for example, undocumented immigrants, commit fewer crimes per capita than native-born Americans or green card holding immigrants. Not green card are the lowest, but fewer crimes per capita than native-born Americans. And crimes. Transgender Americans are vanishingly rare, not crimes against transgender Americans. Unfortunately, that happens quite a lot. So he is not talking about real threats sometimes there is an issue like the quantity of immigration for a period of time in the Biden administration. It was simply more than cities could handle at a given point in time. But the underlying message that these groups are particularly dangerous is not true. And so he is activating fear, and then I said the second part of his message is a populist message. Now, there are two kinds of populism. There's a progressive populism that's policy-oriented, that gives all sorts of detailed plans. Here's how we address primarily the rich-poor gap. Think Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. And they talk about some of the same issues, but they are nothing like President Trump. President Trump is a nationalist populist, and he attacks elites, and his primary point is that elites don't care about ordinary people. Now, the one thing that Trump has been particularly successful at is activating a sense that elites are talking down to ordinary people. And he's been very skilled at that. And I think, frankly, one reason he has been successful is that elites often come across that way. It's
true.
It's an unfortunate truth.
Yes.
And a good example, and sometimes elites, they kind of pick the wrong spokesperson. I personally think Tony Fauci did a magnificent job in dealing with COVID, but it would have been better to have someone else as the public face of dealing with COVID and vaccination campaigns. I'm thinking, Dolly Parton, not Tony Fauci.
Sure. Sometimes the messenger matters, right?
It does. Well, no one doesn't like Dolly.
Yes.
And so he starts out by activating fear. That's the nationalist message that becomes hate. He attacks elites because he claims they don't care about ordinary people. And then the third component is his depiction of himself as increasingly a strong man. That started in the first campaign. He treated himself as a business outsider. As president, that morphed into depicting himself as a strong man hero. And in last few weeks, he always sends trial balloons out, and he calls them jokes, except the trial balloons have a way of becoming key themes or sometimes policies. He's depicted himself as if he were king, and quoted, he put in quotation mark, jokes about another term, which of course he can't have under the Constitution. So he depicts himself as a strongman hero who will do and say things that ordinary people, that other politicians won't do, and that's how he's going to protect ordinary people.
You talked a lot about the idea of fear and targeting the other, right? And that other can change a little bit, and it's oftentimes been immigrants, but you're right. Now in the last presidential campaign, it was trans rights and all of that. This idea of creating an in-group and an out-group. When we think back through history, politicians who've used that type of language are not usually those participating in a democracy, right? I mean, should we be worried by this? I mean, it's hard not to think about, the World War II, the German example, the Hitler example, fascism, Italy, Mussolini, like politicians who tend to use that tool tend to undermine democracy. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it certainly is true that we at times of crisis, the United States has been blessed with leaders who presented, sometimes for the time, an inclusive vision of America and an optimistic vision of America. And we've had people who've had the same message that Donald Trump has, the Know-Nothing Party in the 1840s, Father Coughlin in the Depression era, but we had in this era of Father Coughlin, we had Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Sure.
And in a more recent period, we've had people who presented very inclusive definitions of national identity. And it hasn't always been just liberals. Like I say, Ronald Reagan presented a very inclusive definition of American identity. The conclusion of the farewell address is one of the most eloquent defenses of America, where who you are as an American is defined by your ideals, not any other characteristic. And, of course, President Obama was gifted with that. Now, you are right that in the strategy types that I've talked about certainly were used in the 1930s. And you have radical right parties, Alternative for Germany, some others in Europe that are using similar strategies today. And it's always dangerous when you demonize your fellow citizens, not for something they've done, but for who they are. Sometimes groups do bad things, and that's why we have a criminal justice and other system. But he's demonizing them not for what they've done, but for who they are. I'm thinking of the depiction of undocumented immigrants eating pets, and things, which he had it was very effective as rhetoric. It had the disadvantage of having not happened.
Well, and it makes democracy hard, right? When you demonize the other, when you make the other not just a competitor but evil, it becomes impossible to engage in the normal democratic process, right? Yeah, no, that's really, really engaging. You talk about, I'm curious in how you understand the role of emotion over ideology. And in your book, you argue that Trump holds his supporters, his hold on his supporters is emotional rather than ideological or policy-based, that his supporters really isn't tied to any coherent set of ideology or policy positions. Instead, he creates this emotional bond through his rhetoric. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
That's exactly right. If you think about policies other than deporting large numbers of undocumented immigrants and tariffs, what is the coherent policy agenda that we've heard? There really isn't one. What he does is appeal to a group of Americans who have what's called authoritarian personality structure. And that's not the same as authoritarianism, but it's related. What it is an extreme discomfort with the pace of social change. It's the same group of Americans who, for example, are not just miffed a little bit, but get angry at the idea that someone might have a pronoun other than he or she. And really, who cares what a pronoun someone uses? But there are a lot of people, they find the nature of social change very disquieting, and Trump has shown an incredible ability to activate negative emotions in that particular group of people. And to some extent, the way to deal with that is to activate positive emotions and to point out, to emphasize our shared identity, that we're really more alike than we are different as human beings, regardless of where we're from or what our religion is or whatever else. To some extent, the Democrats have not been very effective in using that message against him, although that's what Barack Obama did every day he was president.
This is absolutely right. And the authoritarian personality is really, really interesting, right? Because we're entering a world where there's likely to be more and more change, more demographic change, more cultural change, right? And then those things are likely to play into the rhetoric and politics of politicians like Donald Trump. I mean, this is it's a long-term challenge for the democracy as a whole. We've got to take a quick break here. We will be right back with more conversations with Robin Rowland.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. We are having a conversation with Robert Rowland, who is the professor of communication studies at the University of Kansas, and we're talking about Trump and his rhetoric. Robin, so I'm curious about Trump over time, and do you see him utilizing different tactics in his campaign versus when he's in office? Have you seen a shift from one administration to the next? As you see, sort of, you think about him over the long haul, what do you see in terms of patterns?
I see two things. First, his message becomes more extreme over time. And so, he talks about the Biden years in utterly dystopian terms. And the same thing is true in his depiction of undocumented immigrants or other groups that he is demonizing. And it is even more true in terms of his claims about his own accomplishments. I mean, he describes America as a dystopia and then claims that he's going to fix it and we're going to have the strongest economy ever. He's done that again and again. I'm thinking of the terms he used in his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention. And the interesting thing there is that now he owns those promises in a way that he didn't own them in the first term, because in the first term he inherited a very strong economy from Barack Obama. And the first 3 years before COVID were almost a straight line continuation of the last 2 years of Obama's second term. So that he faces a very different economic situation this time, and he owns that situation this time.
That's really interesting, right? And again, we're so early into this second administration. I am curious to see how he adapts and evolves. Speaking of you mentioned the congressional address, and it was historic for its length, clocking in at 100 minutes, which broke the previous record set by Bill Clinton in 2000, which was 89 minutes. I remember watching that, thinking that one was too long. So there's a lot for a scholar like yourself to study. What did you notice about the rhetoric of that address, or anything particular that jumped out at you?
Well, one thing I noticed is it doesn't look like a normal State of the Union or a State of the Union substitute, which is basically the same as a State of the Union. Normally, a skillful president will present their agenda. They will organize it thematically, but there will also be a laundry list of new policies. And the goal of the address is to maximize support, and that means trying to appeal to members of the other party in Congress who can sometimes be convinced to vote with whoever's president at the time. Reagan would appeal to the Reagan Democrats, and other presidents. Clinton would have appealed to the most moderate Republicans. Now, as time has gone by, beginning with Republican near universal opposition to everything Barack Obama supported, that approach has broken down a little bit. They opposed Obama on policies, even policies that they previously had supported when President Obama came out with them. And so in that situation, the president focuses on activating the American people to put pressure on Congress. And Trump did neither of those things. What he did was give a rally speech. And it was a rally speech that was, I think you could say, he was trolling the Democrats who were there. And I'm not sure that the response, the holding up signs, et cetera, the one protest, I'm not certain that wasn't precisely what he wanted to have happen, because he's only appealing to his core supporters, and to them that scene sent a message of disrespect toward the president. So I think Trump's message in practically in almost all cases is to activate his own core supporters and to present himself as their hero who will protect them.
It becomes about political theater, and you're right. That's very much what that looked like, and in many ways, the Democrats were just participant in that messaging.
That's right.
Trump's approach often feels like a throwback to the past. I mean, he's always, it's sort of central to his appeal. He's talking about this mythic past where things were better. Like he loves the 1800s now. But one of the lessons that you draw in your manuscript is that while Trump's nationalist populist language feels very much like a throwback, he may may in fact be a preview of a fundamental shift in American political communication styles. We're seeing other politicians, both here and abroad, as well as news commentators, now parroting Trump's tactics. Do you believe that we should expect more of this in the future?
Well, I think, yes, I think is the short answer to that, until it fails. I think the question is what happens. For example, if, as seems quite possible, we have a recession this year, what will that do to Trump's popularity? Historically, economic downturns have devastated the popularity of presidents. George H.W. Bush has the end of the Cold War and then the first Gulf War, and still loses the presidency. Even Reagan in 1981 and 1982, he was quite unpopular. There were predictions in 1982, in the midst of the recession, that he would not even run for re-election. He almost certainly would not have won a second term if the economy hadn't come roaring back. So I think one question is what happens to this, the power of this message, if the policy, nearly magical policy successes, if they don't materialize.
Interesting. Do you think, okay, this is really, really interesting. Do you think, in your book, you talk about that a more skillful politician might put Trump's rhetoric and his rhetorical formula to even more effective use? Do you think that those individuals around him seem at least more devoted to the cause? Do you feel like they're going to be better? I mean, is this that future politician? Or to your earlier point, do you think that this is likely to all implode, given that there's no policy sort of foundation?
Really, can someone like J.D. Vance be even more effective with the message? I think to this point, no one has demonstrated Trump's level of charisma with this message, and Vance has an authenticity problem given other things he has said at various points in time. And for example, the event in the Oval Office with Trump and Zelensky, that his behavior looked to many observers as if it were staged and planned. And that is not something that I think wears very well. So I do think that could happen. We've certainly seen people use it very effectively in Europe, the same kind of rhetorical pattern. But I don't think there's anybody in that kind of Trump orbit who has demonstrated that kind of facility. And whatever else you can say about Donald Trump, he is definitely charismatic.
No, absolutely right. We saw Ron DeSantis try to, in some ways physically, but also rhetorically to sound like Trump, and it just didn't take, right? And maybe that's a good thing, that it's difficult to find politicians who are so effective. One more question, then I'll let you go. But one of the major themes of your books is exploring the implications of his populist nationalist rhetoric for democracy. And I think this is where you are at your best. Can you talk about how this use of this type of rhetoric has impacted and in the future could impact or undermine democracy?
Sure. It does several things. One, it risks dividing us fundamentally about identity, making us hate our fellow citizens. That's how you one of the key ways you pull apart a democracy. It undercuts the power of public reason. And public reason has been something that has always moved us forward. It was our capacity to develop new technologies, but it was also our capacity to expose bigotry. There were no good arguments for segregation. There were many, many good arguments for having, a fair society in which everybody is treated with decency and respect. Everybody has rights. So many, many arguments for the civil rights and women's rights and gay rights movement. He's undercutting both of those things. And the part of the danger is a gradual slippage away from democratic norms. And, I think we certainly have seen that in his so-called jokes about another term or jokes about being a king. And one of the big risks now is that he is the only blockage on him at this point are the federal courts. And if he chooses to simply ignore court orders, we have a constitutional crisis. There are people who think we're in the midst of such a constitutional crisis. So there are all those pressures on him that are extremely dangerous. But I don't like to be just totally scared.
Yeah.
I do think that he has predicted for his core supporters this utopia. And that has to happen, or he's not going to maintain support. I'm thinking of when George W. Bush landed on the carrier and with the mission accomplished sign, and it was great theater.
Yeah.
But the mission accomplished sign was not right. And a civil war was beginning to brew in Iraq. And 2 years later, it didn't look like mission accomplished. So democracy is built, the founders built a self-correcting nature into our system. And there is still a power, as John Adams famously said, that facts are stubborn things. Now, they're not quite as stubborn as they were in John Adams' time.
Yeah.
But the predictions that Trump has made, they better start bearing out, or his supporters are going to notice.
This has been really, really thoughtful. We've been speaking with Robert Rowland, who's a professor of communication studies at the University of Kansas, where he teaches rhetoric and argumentation. Thank you, Robin, for your time and your insight. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
What a delight. What smart questions.
Thank you so much. We'll hopefully chat again sometime in the future.
Great.
All right, we need to get to a break, but before we do so, we've got a little contest going on, and let me read you this. The crazy African king of comedy will have you doubled over when Michael Blackson comes to the Genesee on March 27th. Blackson keeps audiences laughing with humorous insights on everything from relationships and life in his native homeland. Tickets are available through Ticketmaster and the Genesee Theater Box office in Waukegan and GeneseeTheater.com, but luckily, WCPT has a pair of tickets for you, maybe you. Paul is going to be taking calls. One of you will get those tickets. So you've got to be over 18, residents of the greater Chicagoland, Northwest Indiana area. One entry per person, one winner per household. Void where prohibited by law. So we're going to go to a break. And if you are interested, 773-763-9278. Give Paul a call and you might be lucky enough to get those tickets. We'll be right back.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. We are now joined by Professor Suzanne Chad, who specializes in American politics at North Central College. Dr. Chad is a regular with Joan, and I would argue that pound for pound, there's not a better analyst of American politics, certainly in the Chicagoland area, but maybe in the country. So welcome back, Suzanne.
How am I going to live up to that, Bill?
You got to hype up the guest.
Thank you.
Yes. So, no, we're so happy to chat with you today. And what I want us to talk about is the state of the Democratic Party. And I want us to get there. But before we do that, I absolutely have to give you a chance to react to the roughly, 48, 50 first days of the Trump administration. How are you feeling? What are you seeing? What's going on? Give me your general reactions.
Wait, how much time do we have exactly?
As much as you need.
Yeah, as much as I know, it is. As you've been hosting the last couple of days and had great guests on that have dissected this in really important ways. And I think the best way that I can describe it is something I've said to you repeatedly, which, because we chat in the morning always in the office, is it as bad as I think? Is it worse than I think? Is it exactly what I think? How is it bad today compared to the day before? And how will it be bad tomorrow? And so really what that is for me is sort of the unpredictable nature in some ways of how things have gone. There's the predictability of him promising all the things that he was going to do in the campaign trail and in Project 2025, and people saying, don't take him seriously, he won't do it. But political scientists know better and know Trump better and knew that he was going to do most of these things. And so there's a predictability and expectation in some of the things, a lot of the things that he's doing. But I think, and this is where I defer to you so much, is the nature of his blowing up of these allyships in such a short amount of time across the world, and the shifting nature of the global order, which is not my expertise, but is the most alarming to me, I think, right now, because it feels so far away, I think, to the average person, right? It feels so far away, and we have that big, beautiful ocean between us and Europe and Russia and all of that. And so the alarm bells going off in our discipline feel feels almost like too loud for the average person. And I think that, to me, has been hard to impart to students. I think you've had sort of the same thing, especially since I'm not a foreign policy expert, to tell them, like, go talk to Dr. Muck. He knows exactly what's going on. But I would say that the predictability of the domestic side of it is where I sit, but it's the unpredictability and how fast things have seemed to unravel and how fast Europe has responded. And, you know, your favorite Fareed Zakaria, I was listening to him yesterday morning, and one of the things that he said was, we're watching America crumble before us in the world order. And I was like, wow.
Yes.
Okay, good morning.
And you're seeing that now where smart people who've spent their life studying this are having that type of assessment. And you and I mean, we've been talking and writing and thinking about Donald Trump for a decade now, and highlighting the grave threat that we believe he is. But I would say, and I'm curious about your thought this, I think he's been worse than I anticipated, right? We spent the last 4 or 5 years saying this would be really dangerous. Democracy is at stake. And in the first 45, 50 days, I think it's been worse than I even imagined. What's your sense on the balance there?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing for me that's been the most staggering as an institutionalist, as someone who still believes in the value of elected institutions and appointed institutions in the United States, and someone who really believes in separate institutions sharing powers. And you know, you and I have gotten into it about whether we're in a constitutional crisis, and,
right.
and you know, I've been reluctant to say yes, and you've been not reluctant to say yes, and and so it's the one thing we disagree on, basically. But what I think all that to say is that where I sit now, because of, you know, we knew he was going to go after judges in the courts because he did it in his first term, but this is different, right? This is Congress rolling over, and the little amount of oversight authority and authority they actually had left after conceding so much to the executive over the past 60 years is completely gone. And so the courts are the only kind of bastion left to uphold our democracy. And while things are moving through the courts, they're moving slow. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court's been reluctant to take a definitive stance on what this looks like in terms of the unilateral executive and unitary executive. And so because of, you know, Congress is doing nothing, that Musk and Vance and Trump and the rest of the Republican Party is saying that the court has no legitimacy, and they just keep pushing. I think that's where I sit now, where it's worse than expected, because I thought that there'd be some check left, and states as well. Yeah. You know, I don't think there's that you know, the states can do much or want to do much, and so that's where I feel like those checks are eroding and crumbling.
Yeah, pretty dire situation there. Yes, not surprised that's kind of your take on it. So, well, let's transition and talk a little bit about the Democratic Party. So the prevailing analysis, wherever you go to read about the Democrats, is that they are rudderless with no clear leading voice or policy agenda. The criticism suggests that the party doesn't know where it stands, what it stands for, or how to respond to Trump. I'd like to put some context on this. What's your sense of these criticisms and the state of the Democratic Party? It feels, again, very dire when you read anything about the party lately.
Yeah, this is where, you know, where our last conversation was that the alarm bells people aren't listening to, and they should be louder. And I think in this conversation, the alarm bells are too loud, and we should not be listening to. You know, you and I talked about this, that this is always what happens after a loss, right? The party sort of, you know, sits on its hands for a little while and says, okay, where did it go wrong, and what happened, and what do we need to do? And sometimes it is like larger scale programmatic and platform changes. Other times it's strategic changes to like where they try to pick up seats and so forth. And I think what's happening right now is sort of similar to what happened after Mitt Romney lost in 2012. And the Republican Party was like, okay, we need this postmortem. We need to see, you know, why did he do so bad with this group, this group, this group? Why is it that it feels like the Republicans have no traction in the U.S. political system right now? And the suggestion that was made was in some ways the suggestion the Democrats are getting now is just to moderate. Right. That's almost always the suggestion that is made after there's a loss, is just run to the middle, be as bland and vanilla as possible in what you talk about and how you talk about it, to try to get as many people as it, you know, to get on board as possible. And that was actually the recommendation that was made, was to run to the center on cultural issues and to try to bring in minoritized voices who felt very much left out by Mitt Romney and the party. And, of course, we know that's not what the party did. They did the exact opposite of that and went further to the right than we could have ever expected. And so I think that in some ways the suggestion now for the Democratic Party to run to the center and be as bland and vanilla as possible, we just know that doesn't work. Now, I'm not suggesting that they run all the way to the left as far right as the Republicans ran.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's a smart sort of general assessment to say, okay, let's stop talking about issues related to identity. Let's stop talking about intersections. Let's just talk about the cost of things. Let's talk about the middle class. Let's run the Bernie Sanders campaign without the democratic socialism.
Sure.
And ignore all of the things that are important to our base. And quite frankly, important to the country. Some of those things are still important to the country. I just think it's generic advice that doesn't work in this context.
Well, that's really interesting, right? Because the polling, like when you ask Democrats or you ask Americans where the party needs to move, it's like overwhelming. They're like, it needs to moderate, too liberal. Right. But you're suggesting that actually that may not be the best path forward for the Democrats.
Yeah, and I think some of this was your conversation with Robin before, is the branding of this, right? Is that in some ways this is not all that different from what was happening in the late 90s, early 2000s, where liberal became this dirty word, right? Like when Bill Clinton was president, liberal was this code word that was used for like too radical, too far left, sort of a code word for communist or socialist. And Barack Obama did a little bit when he was first president to sort of soften that, but then, of course, as a reaction to just his existence, that didn't last for very long in terms of what liberal meant. And so, right? So I think that that's what's happened now, is that the Republican Party has done such a good job of recalibrating what the word liberal means, that people are reluctant to say that they're liberal in a way that we've never really seen before. And so just because of that, I think, and what is now associated with liberal, right? Because if you think about it, when you are watching ads for the 2024 election or you're listening to people talk now, if you tell people they're liberal, they're like, oh, well, that means that you probably want our teachers to do gender-affirming surgery in the classroom.
Right.
Well, like, that's not what being liberal means. And so I think when people say that the party's too liberal, they're just reacting to what they think that word means, and not really being asked to think about what is it that you care about and what do you want to see done in this country. And now, to be fair, I don't think we often know the answer to that question, but we're not really being asked. And I think that's part of the problem.
This is okay. I've got a follow-up question, but we need to sneak a quick break in here. And when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about that and what maybe that means as we think about how Democrats talk about trans rights. How do they talk about DEI, right? Turning liberal into a dirty word, like how the Democrats overcome that. So we are chatting with Dr. Suzanne Chad from North Central College, and we'll be back in just a second.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. We are chatting with Dr. or Professor Suzanne Chad and talking about all things American politics and specifically the Democratic Party. Before we get back to that, I want to let everybody know that WCPT is celebrating their 20th anniversary, and they're going to have an event. Tickets are now on sale for their 20th anniversary, which will be on May 3rd. It's actually an anniversary broadcast at Max and Benny's in Northbrook. Hal Sparks, Joan Esposito, Richard Chu, Patty Vasquez, and Scott Duff will all be there broadcasting live from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. with special guests, maybe me, and maybe we can even pull in Suzanne Chad. Learn more and get your tickets by visiting heartlandsignal.com/anniversary. And again, that's May 3rd, WCPT's 20th anniversary. Kind of a big deal. All right, Suzanne, before break, we were talking about like liberal becoming a dirty word. And how do Democrats overcome that? And how do they respond to some of the criticism that has been relenting from Republicans on DEI and on trans rights? I mean, how do they balance that? What's the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, this is the existential question for the party, right? And part of the issue is that the Democratic Party has such a heterogeneous base that it has to speak to more kinds of people than a pretty homogenous Republican Party has to do. And so in and of itself, that is a challenge in terms of branding and platforming and messaging, right? That's already difficult.
Yeah.
And so what I think the challenge for the party right now, and while there's been so much criticism of Kamala Harris's campaign, which I think most of it is quite unwarranted, I think that the messaging that she used in her campaign that leaned into patriotism. It leaned into liberty and freedom. It leaned into community. And because she was the one delivering the message, it screamed radical and liberal just because, again, like Obama, like her existence. But I think there is a way to talk about issues that are important to the Democratic base and issues that are important to people who've gone back and forth between the parties over the last 3 elections that doesn't scream liberal. Now, that's one part of the equation, because unfortunately the second and in some ways more important part of the equation is that the way the Republican Party is going to say that is still the liberal woke agenda, regardless of how they message it. And so I actually think that the harder battle for the party is not creating the messaging, it's combating the right's reaction to whatever their messaging is.
And that response, and this is interesting, sort of goes back to the conversation I was having with Robert Rowland about ideology versus policy, right? The Democrats are going to continue to lead with policy, to say, hey, we're the party of good governance, and we're going to solve these problems. We're going to make your life better at the local and national level. And Trump and the Republicans are going to come along and talk about ideology. Can policy and can that overcome this, not ideology, identity? Can that overcome identity politics?
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. I don't, right? And my students ask me these questions, and I'm always like, I don't know, or it depends. And they're like, oh God, Chad. And I'm like, no, but because we know as political scientists that we can't predict, we can try to forecast, but there's all these conditions we have to look at before we, make some kind of forecast. And I think because no matter what the left does, someone on the right is calling race or gender card, even though it's actually those on the right that are playing the race and gender card, the sexuality card, and, fill in the blank, right? And so I think part of what's going to happen, and I don't think that a lot of people in the party, both at the elite level and the more progressive wing of the party, is going to like my answer. But I think part of what's going to happen is that the messaging that's coming out of elites is going to be, okay, let's go after waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. Let's fight against, maybe the way Musk is doing it. But maybe they need to start talking about, the scalpel and not the chainsaw, right? Maybe they do need to start thinking about ways in which they can work with the party to the Republican Party, some kind of compromise on the budget. There has to be some governing that happens. And I think that if the party can show that it can govern and not necessarily cave on the things that are most important, but can govern in meaningful ways and get some wins that they can go on the campaign trail with, it gives them some currency. And I think that's something that they've been reluctant to do, even though Jeffries has sort of talked about doing that, because there's so much screaming on the left about doing that, but not like nothing's working. So why not try that at this point? Because it's easier to deliver a message about community and liberty and freedom and good governance if you're actually engaging in governance. And it's really hard when you're the minority party to engage in governance. So maybe that's one of the things, I think that's one of the things they have to do right now.
No, absolutely, right? And maybe that governing stuff drops down to the state and local level, right? That's where you do those things. And then you point to that to say, hey, here's what we're doing. And again, there are, we see this all the time with our students. Like, there are real things that they are concerned about. They're the same things that most Americans are concerned about, the cost of living and, hey, am I going to be able to buy a home? Like, these are real things that strike me as it might be able to break through some of that identity politics, right? Yeah, sure. I feel strong about my identity, but if the Democrats make it easier to buy a house, that would transform my political support.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's absolutely right. And sometimes it's hard to get them to think that far ahead, right? And so one of the things that we talk, I'm sure you do this as well, is talk a lot about student loan debt with our students, right? And, I don't know, I'm sure you saw, although it's like such fast-paced news over the past couple of days, that Trump signed an executive order getting rid of the public service loan forgiveness program.
Yes, yeah.
So a program that I was eligible for and I very proudly applied for and was able to get my remaining student loans forgiven after 15 years working as an educator. But those are the kinds of programs that, because things happen so fast and Trump did this so under the radar because of all the other things that are on fire, like those are the things that the Democratic Party can talk about. But they don't need to talk about it in a way that is blaming or, the president is overreaching and all the things which are true, by the way.
Yeah.
But but more about here's a program that was designed to help you once you give back to your community that's now no longer an option for you. Or for parents who are paying on their kids' student loans that now will not be eligible to get those forgiven either, right? I mean, there's a pocket of people where that one act by the president can be a huge talking point if done without blame and if done as, I think it's done smart, so to speak.
Yeah.
But it's finding opportunities like that, to your point. It's finding opportunities like that that to point to that can say, like, okay, here's a thing that we did. Here's a thing that existed that no longer exists anymore. And this is what they're trying to do, is to give you less opportunity. But let's not focus on what they're doing. Let's focus on what we can do to provide you opportunity and to make college more affordable and to get interest rates down and make healthcare more affordable and all of those things. Let's focus on governance and not focus on blaming.
It sidesteps some of the partisanship, right? And then you just become the party that is solving problems. Let's talk a little bit about demographics. And, for a lot of time, for years, people were talking about that the demographic shift in the country was going to absolutely benefit Democrats and that Republicans were going to be running scared of this. And the reality is it hasn't worked out as anticipated. So as you think about various different shifting demographic groups and how the party appeals to them, what are you thinking about in terms of where the vote on the presidential election went, or where the party needs to be thinking about how to connect to these various different demographic groups?
Yeah, I mean, this is, to your point, it's like the party thought that they had this changing country locked up, right? You see all these graphics in the past couple of years, like, if only minoritized people voted, Democrats would win everything, right? And so they're like, woohoo, we got it locked up. And then obviously that's not where it's gone. And so I think, and you and I have talked about this before, but I think that the intersection that is missing from the conversation, or not even an identity, but the pocket of people that are missing from the conversation, are those who are not paying attention to the news, those who are not politically knowledgeable. Because what we know and what the data are very clear about is that the people that decided the election were the least politically knowledgeable, because they overwhelmingly voted for Trump. And that crossed different identity demographics, right? And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus, I mean, of all people, I'm not saying we should focus on the party should not focus on how to talk to these groups who are shifting. But I actually think the harder thing, and you were talking about this with one of the callers, is how do we get people to care? And how do we get people to be knowledgeable and not just to listen to Joe Rogan, for example? Yes. And you always say, and you said this in the last segment, about complex, like simple solutions to complex problems, right? How can the bigger problem, I think, for the Democratic Party is not as much about getting different demographics to come back home, quote, home, but it's how does the party get people to be knowledgeable, to care, and also the combating of mis and disinformation, but to just dip in to know some stuff. Because when you dip in and you know some stuff, those people that did that voted for Democrats.
Yeah.
So it's never just, it's never just one piece. It's all the pieces of the puzzle. And I think the piece that we're not talking enough about is the pocket of voters who decided this election across different states, which were the ones who were not politically knowledgeable or engaged.
Interesting. I like that. That's really thoughtful. So we got like 90 seconds left, but I got to get one more question in for you. James Carville, I talked about at the opening of the show. His advice for Democrats is to play possum, play dead, let the Republicans do what they're going to do, and then wait till they blow it up and then jump back. What do you think about that strategy I think it's a terrible idea, but you're smarter on American politics than I am. What's your reaction to Carville and the idea that Democrats should just step away from it all?
Oh, it's a terrible idea.
Good.
It's such a bad idea. Yeah, it's such a bad idea. And listen, James Carville is brilliant, and he did a lot of really important things for the way the campaigns are run, revolutionary in all kinds of ways outside of just Democratic Party politics. But that, to me, what he's saying is it works, except it doesn't, because the country can be the irreparable damage that's going to happen if the Democrats just sit back and do nothing. The stakes are too high, right? I mean, we see the last 50 days what it's already looked like. And so if the Democrats just do nothing at the state and federal level and just like roll over and let the party implode, we're all going down with the ship. I think, like we were talking about before, maybe try to help steer the ship a little bit and figure out a way to try to take control. I'm using this metaphor all the way to the logical end. Try to figure out a way to actually take the controls by the time we get to the midterm.
I like all of that, right? I always feel like we learn from you, and I'm sure the audience absolutely loves your insights, and we know a little bit more about American politics. We've been speaking with Professor Suzanne Chad from North Central College. Thank you, Suzanne, for sharing some of your thoughts and insights with us.
Thank you, Bill. All
right, we'll talk soon. We got to take a quick break, and we're going to be back right after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are now joined by Lauren Cho, who is the Communications Director for the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, or the DLCC. This is the arm of the Democratic Party with the mission of building democratic power in the states and setting the national agenda at the state level. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us. We are delighted to have you on WCPT.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a great time to be talking about the states.
Absolutely. So let's start with some basics. So why don't you tell us and our listeners a little bit about the DLCC, the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee? Some of them may not have heard of this organization. So what kind of work do you do? What's going on at the state level?
Totally. Yeah. So we are the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee. We are the sole Democratic committee that's responsible for setting the strategy to build power, basically, in the state legislature. So we do this by flipping chambers. We do it by maintaining Democratic majorities in places where we have them. We break Republican supermajorities in places where, we have a Democratic governor and we want to defend their veto pen. So that's a little bit about what it's like to build the power in the states. We also work to create competitive environments year round, right? So we have year-round investments. We have year-round involvement with all 50 states. And our work is to build this pipeline of future Democratic leaders. A lot of state legislators end up going on to be members of Congress. They sometimes run for president, right? So it's a huge pipeline. I think, it's this really exciting opportunity with the DLCC to build not just the pipeline of party leaders, but good Democratic policies that follow these party leaders all the way to the federal government. And of course, the last kind of piece of what we do and focus on is redistricting, because it happens every 10 years. And, we are looking towards 2030 and working to basically just put the Democratic Party in the best position possible across the country for redistricting, to make sure that we have fair state legislative and also congressional maps, because a lot of the times it's decided at the state legislative level.
This is really interesting, right? Because so much of this conversation is at the national level, and it feels like oftentimes our politics have been nationalized. But the really exciting stuff oftentimes is at the state and local level. And our listeners should go and check out the DLCC, the webpage, which is super easy to remember. It's dlcc.org. Great little webpage there. And so one of the things on that page is that you talk about, there's this quote which I really thought was fascinating. State legislatures are the front lines of democracy, where policies affecting Americans' day-to-day lives become reality. So, and again, we're so often at the national level. Why should we be paying attention to the state and local level? Why is that so important?
Yeah, well, right now, this is the only level of the ballot where we have Democratic majorities, right? So I think a lot of the times what I hear from folks is, yes, we want to resist the Republican Trump administration, but what are we for? What are we doing proactively? What solutions are we presenting? And the state legislative level, where we have Democratic majorities, is the one place at this moment in time where we're able to proactively offer these solutions and legislate on them and deliver on them. Democrats in Washington are working to resist Republican majorities in the House and the Senate, the Trump administration. And so state legislatures right now are doing a lot of really, really good work. I always say, with every day that passes, a state legislator goes to work and they do the work that people wanted to see Donald Trump do, but he's failing and refusing to do so. He's focused on chaos. He's focused on dismantling the federal government. But these legislators are delivering on things like lowering costs, fighting price gouging, right? Increasing access to affordable housing and rent control, and making sure that there are good paying jobs and opportunities in the states. And so, I think that this is the moment where Democrats are able to, one, kind of think proactively about what we want to offer. And two, state legislators, I often find, are the best messengers for what we're doing. They are members of their communities. They are they are, your teachers, they are your nurses, they are your accountants, right? They are the people who, in your community, their kids grow up alongside yours. They know these challenges because they've lived the challenges that the community faces. And so a lot of the times when they come to their communities and they're asking what's important, they're throwing around these ideas. They're, trying to communicate what they're doing to work on these issues. Communities trust their legislators. Communities know their legislators. And so this is such an exciting time, I think, to pay attention to this ballot level and plug in, because we could all use a little bit of hope, I think, in this moment. And I really, truly would say state legislatures are the place that are offering a lot of that right now.
Well, that's really interesting, because that's where I kind of was curious about the next question, which is like, what are you seeing at the state and local level in terms of the mood, right? I know, this period after the Trump election, basically through the inauguration, there were a lot of Democrats who just pulled away from politics, right? There was a sense of like, I don't know where to go. I can't engage anymore. The sense of disillusionment. So what's it sounds like there's more energy at the state and local level. What are you seeing? How are people feeling?
They're feeling, I think, really defiant, really productive, really energized. They're working on, Virginia legislators just wrapped up their session. They did a lot of really good work on lowering the cost of prescription drugs, on, expanding access to affordable health care and making sure that, prices weren't being raised out of nowhere. They were working on, making sure that contraception was available to folks. They were working on these really, really important issues, and they were getting things done, which I think is, something that a lot of people don't feel like happens in Washington, D.C. a lot of the times. But, they're prioritizing things like lowering the cost of housing, right? States like Oregon, New Mexico, Massachusetts, Minnesota, which is on our target map, looking towards billions of dollars invested to increase the supply of homes. That is something that affects every person's everyday life, right? You're talking about tax reliefs, cracking down on predatory landlords, protecting renters. That is something that affects every single person every day of their lives. Eliminating grocery taxes, right? Like I mentioned, banning price gouging, all of these things, making it easier to afford childcare, elder care for your family members. That is something that so many people need. Paid family and medical leave. These are access to community college, apprenticeship programs. These are things that legislators right now are actively working on delivering. And so they are focused, they're getting to work. And, I think the beauty of this is that they don't get distracted by what's happening in DC. A lot of the times, the media storm that Trump creates, the chaos that he incites, can be really easy to get lost in. But legislators are so focused on going to work every single day, serving the people that are their neighbors, that raise their kids, right? That treat them and, provide for their communities. And, they just don't get lost in the national craziness in a way that I think, makes this ballot level so special.
Well, and that's a really great point, because, national politics matters, right? The federal level matters, but on a day-to-day level, oftentimes it is the state level governance that is really impacting us on a day-to-day level in terms of education, all those other issues. And it's easy to watch, the chaos at the federal level and lose track of the sense of what can happen at the local level. And so I'm curious about your opinion. So, the other night, Donald Trump gave his big election speech, or is in front of the Congress, and the coverage was pretty interesting. It was a celebratory tone for the Republicans, which isn't surprising. They're in a very electorally advantaged position. And some of the conversation was that the Democrats need to develop a strategy for dealing with Trump. And so I'm curious about what your sense of the strategy of the Democratic Party right now is at the state level. Like, what, if you had to kind of describe what's that long-term strategy? How is the Democratic Party adapting to this new reality? What are we seeing that's going on?
I mean, I think that what we saw from the joint address was a campaign speech, right? We saw chaos, we saw division, and we saw, once again, right, I feel like the joint address was the embodiment of what he's been doing since he got into office, which is just dismantling the federal government. And the state Democrats, I think, are providing this way forward in the fact that they're not listening to the chaos. They're focused on delivering. I look at this as like a dismantling versus delivering kind of, very, very stark contrast here. State Democrats are, again, going to work every single day, and they're doing the things that voters want to see their legislators, their government, their public servants doing for them. These are the issues that they care about. And I think the beauty of state legislatures as well is that they are able to hyper tailor their work, their messages to the communities in a way that I don't know that you always have the flexibility and affordability to do on a larger scale, right? I always think about that forever ago, 2018, I think it was, Danica Roem mentioned, I think it was mulch, became a huge part of her campaign in Virginia because they were using highly flammable materials in playgrounds and in the gardens around the elementary schools, which presented a huge danger to the community, to the kids. Like, what if there were an accident to happen and you have highly flammable material everywhere? It became a huge piece of what she was doing. It was a huge piece of her work, huge focus. I don't know that you would necessarily see, a statewide or a presidential campaign that could focus it on mulch.
You're right.
But you have legislators who are able to do that. And I think this no nonsense, we are here to get things done approach that we bring at this ballot level is kind of a refreshing answer to, we're just here to take things apart and have people lose their jobs. And when you see higher prices at the grocery store, when we institute these tariffs that make your life harder, that hurt American workers, we're just going to leave you to it, And I think the fact that Democratic legislators are answering these problems, especially at a time where I think, as people are losing their jobs, as the federal government is just, I keep using the word dismantling because that's genuinely what's happening. State legislatures are going to have to answer this call of, how do we fill that void? How do we provide stability? How do we lead the way forward for our state? How do we protect our state in this moment where all of it is going to fall on the state legislatures to do so? I saw that, Nevada, the assembly actually pushed the governor to fast track hiring fired federal employees to fill vacancies in the Nevada state government. They are already finding these solutions and trying to figure out ways to help working people who just lost their jobs, who need to provide for their families, who need to pay for their medicine, who need to care for their, elderly parents, who have bills and rent to make. They are actively trying to figure out already ways to kind of fill this void that is being left by Washington, D.C.
It strikes me this is more almost a sort of philosophical difference between the Democrats at the state level and what's going on at the federal level with the Republicans, right? Are you governing or are you politicking, right? And my sense of your strategy is that the state level focuses on the idea of good governance, right? Show the people what you believe in, but more importantly, show them why good governance matters for their day-to-day life. Again, and that's such a stark contrast with what Trump's doing at the national level, right? It's not about good governance. I don't think he cares about governance. It's about identity, grievance, political theater and entertainment, and very little about what's happening there is governance based. He's not interested in it. But so here's the question, right? That Trump approach has proven to be electorally successful at the national level, sort of distract people, make it about identity politics. At the state level, how do you win elections by showing people that governance and good governance matters, right? Because he's been really effective at distracting everybody.
Right. Well, I think what's interesting there is that in 2024, the state legislative level was the only ballot level that didn't see the red wave in the way that we did everywhere else. We were able to stave off the red wave. And I think a lot of it, right, comes down to what I was saying, which is people know their state legislators. People trust their state legislators. They see them on the doors constantly. They have contact with them. And so when they come to you and they talk about these solutions, you're inclined to listen. And so I would say that in this moment, right, it's very much so about talking about what we're doing. But I also think that we are taking a step back to kind of think about who the best messengers of that work might be. And a lot of the times I would say your state and local leaders are the best stewards for the Democratic Party platform of what we're doing, because their communities know them. And because it's the same thing with organizing, right? You want to have organizers of their communities who are talking to their communities. And it's very much so the same thing with state legislators. The work that we're doing, the party's platform is best communicated by state legislators. The foundation of a strong Democratic Party comes from making sure that people at this ballot level, that leaders at this ballot level are empowered to reach their communities where they are.
This is really interesting. We need to take a quick break, but we will come back and we'll talk more about democracy and the Democratic Party at the state level.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito. Lauren Chu, who's the campaign strategist for the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, and we are talking about all things at the state level. And so I really would like our listeners to go to the DLCC's webpage, because one of the more interesting things is your target map. And you highlight some of the states that you think Democrats really need to be focusing on moving forward. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're targeting and what's going on with that target map?
Yeah, absolutely. So our target map kind of identifies and defines the election cycle's best and most consequential opportunities to build power, durable Democratic power in the state legislatures. So, we're mid-decade. It's 2025. We cannot afford to miss this moment to put Democrats in the best possible place before 2030 happens, before redistricting happens. It's never been more important. We have 39 state legislative majorities. They oversee nearly half the country's population. So think about that, right? Under a Republican trifecta in Washington, D.C., nearly half of Americans still have Democratic leadership that is advocating for them across the country in at least one chamber. That is a huge, huge number, and that's a huge, huge impact, right? Because of the things that I just mentioned, right? Nevada Assembly leaders pushing to find solutions to the fact that federal workers are losing their jobs. Can we plug them in at the state level? Looking at ways to lower costs, looking at ways to expand job opportunities and learning opportunities, right? So the fact that nearly half of this country still has Democratic leaders advocating for them is a big, big deal. And we want to make sure that we're expanding that, not just because we want to be the firewall, but because there's a lot of really good work that can be done here. Over the next 2 years, these legislators are going to decide these policies that truly do affect your everyday lives. You look, I think a lot of people oftentimes look at Congress as the body that affects, what happens to them, but it's really your state legislators. It's really the legislatures, the House and the Senate in your state that are working on the policies that make the most immediate impact on your life. Right. And so we have our target map of states. We kind of split them into 3 different categories. One is the, battleground target. Virginia, the House being one of them. The Senate's not up the cycle, but the Virginia House has a 1-seat majority right now. That is really, really tight, right? And so we have, our target maps. We have our power building states where we're looking to expand the Democratic number of seats over the next couple of cycles. And then we have, states where we're looking to make sure that we maintain the majorities, Maine being one of them, right? One of the states that I'm really, really excited about is Wisconsin. Personally, I love Wisconsin. I've worked in Wisconsin. I lived in Wisconsin for a little, so I'm generally a huge Wisconsin fan. But I would say, we have a really interesting Supreme Court race that is happening in Wisconsin right now. April 1st is the election date. But the last Supreme Court race in Wisconsin, Janet Protasiewicz's election led to fair maps in Wisconsin for the first time in a really long time, right? And it led to Democrats being able to pick up 14 seats in the legislature. It's a huge deal. Put the majorities for both of those chambers in reach for this cycle in a way that, wouldn't have been possible without those fair maps. And so we added the Supreme Court race to our target map for that very reason, right? These fair maps put the majority for both the House, for the Assembly and for the Senate in Wisconsin within reach for us, which is really exciting. So, we're watching that race. We are actively kind of figuring out ways to make sure that Republicans can't buy the seat, because the other thing that I'll say is Republicans saw just as well as Democrats did the difference that fair maps make in those elections, right? They lost 14 seats in the legislature last cycle, and they're really trying to buy this seat in Wisconsin because they know the difference that it makes. And so we've added that to our target map for that reason, to make sure that we are preserving fair maps and the pathway to the majorities in both chambers in Wisconsin.
like you, I'm also impartial to Wisconsin, from Wisconsin, and pay a ton of attention because you're right. It's such an interesting state, and a state where it is a truly divided state, red-blue state amidst purple. And what has happened, over the last couple decades is the Republican Party has been very strategic at that state level to basically develop the supermajority in the state legislature and the Supreme Court. And you're right. You're just starting to see Democrats be able to peel that back. And in the process, I would say, move toward a better democracy, right? You want that system to represent the votes of the public, right? And it's just not there anymore. And, gerrymandering on either side is problematic. But I think what you've seen in Wisconsin is that state legislature hasn't represented the will of the people. So, and everything you hear is that Elon is throwing lots and lots of money into that Supreme Court state. Do you have a sense? I mean, are you guys feeling good about this, or as you look at what's happening in Wisconsin, what's the mood there?
It's going to be close. I mean, Wisconsin is a perennial battleground state, right? So it's going to be very close. It's the most expensive Supreme Court race to date. And so it's going to be a really, really tight one. I think, again, like you said, Elon Musk is engaging in this race. Republicans know the stakes of it, right? They're engaging this way for a reason, because they know what happened the last time that they, lost the seat. They know what happened. They saw the 14 seats go to Democrats under these fair maps. And so, they're trying to preserve this, go back to the system of legislators choosing their voters instead of voters choosing their legislators, right? Which is just not the way that democracy should work at all. I actually, The Guardian wrote this really interesting story I saw the other day about billionaires who are engaging at the state legislative level, ultra right-wing billionaires who are putting funds towards the state legislatures because they saw that the red wave didn't expand all the way down the ballot to legislatures for the first time. Democrats were outperforming the top of the ticket at the state legislative level, but they saw where the red wave didn't reach. They saw the difference that fair maps make. They know that these legislatures oftentimes affect daily life. And, they use the legislatures. Look at Project 2025, right? They had tested those in the state legislatures before they moved it up to the federal government. And so these Republican billionaires are pumping money down ballot, which makes this level of the ballot even more important, right? Republicans recognize the stakes just as well as we do. And they're clearly willing to engage here to try to take away people's rights, to try to dismantle government and cause chaos and hurt working people all the way down to the state legislative level.
Can I get you to maybe expand a little bit on that? Because I think this is such an important point. This is something the Republicans have paid attention to, and like you said, the billionaires for a long period of time, right? Yeah. That they understand, and maybe in a way that Democrats always maybe haven't to the same degree, that you start at the states, right? That's where you do this. And when Republicans do this, they're focusing on rolling back civil liberties, or at least that's my sense of it. That's where they go. So some of these issues, if we're talking about abortion rights or racial profiling, or maybe most specifically like voting rights, this is where Republican attention has been paid, because they know sometimes that doesn't work at the national level, very, very strategically attacking this at the state level. So maybe talk a little bit about what you're seeing there.
Yeah. And, when they buy these legislatures, when these ultra right-wing billionaires are funding candidates, they're funding extreme candidates who then go to office and enact the extreme legislation that mirrors what these billionaires are pushing for. That's the danger of this, right? It's one, the fact that they are trying to buy these seats and these legislatures and these majorities, but it's another thing that these candidates that they're funding are going to legislatures and pushing these really, really extreme policies. I mean, just last week, Republicans in Montana, right, put forward a first of its kind bill that would prosecute women and charge them with trafficking if they were trying to seek reproductive care somewhere else. That is extreme. The fact, and again, right, I'll say, if you're looking at where each party's priorities are, look at what they're putting forth. Democrats are putting forth legislation on price gouging, on lowering costs. They're putting forth bills that will prosecute women, right? That is the priority. And they're pushing this really, really dangerous agenda on the state levels. And they're being funded by these ultra conservative billionaires who want to see that happen, right? I mean, South Carolina and West Virginia, right, introduced bills to remove rape and incest exceptions from abortion bans. So, you're looking at the most extreme kind of policies, emerging in state legislatures, and they're going to start popping up across state legislatures. And like Project 2025, they might migrate back up to the federal level once they've expanded.
That's such a compelling argument for paying attention to the state level.
It is really dangerous, right?
Yeah, right, because that's where it's happening. So, and I will say, we're here in Illinois, and I can't tell you the number of people, Democrats specifically, but Democratic women even more specifically this last few weeks who I've spoken with, who maybe in the past didn't really have a deep sense of pride about living in Illinois, and who now see J.B. Pritzker and Illinois and the rights and freedoms that are protected and preserved at the state level. They're wearing this as a badge of honor. It's really something, right? So what's your assessment? I mean, I'm guessing you're feeling comfortable about what's happening in Illinois, but I'm guessing that's something that has to be protected and preserved, right? Even these blue states, you need to continue to think about how do you protect and preserve those majorities.
Absolutely. And right, the blue states were already getting to work after Trump was elected to start moving those protections in place because they knew what Donald Trump was going to do when he got into office. They knew what he was going to try to do to hurt working people. And so you saw the blue states kind of kick into action immediately to start preserving and protecting some of these rights, to start trying to mitigate the chaos that they knew was going to come down from the Trump administration. And so that is incredibly important as we're looking at, how what's happening in the federal government is going to affect what's happening in the state legislatures as the pressure increases on the states to kind of figure out how to provide these answers and support working people when the support from the federal government goes away. Incredibly important at the state legislative level.
Oh, this is so interesting. And I'm guessing for many of our listeners, sort of a sense of empowerment.